So, Team Fortress 2. Team Fortress 2 is an extremely weird game, right? Like, it's a really good game, but it is really weird. Maybe not as strange as something like Stalker Simulator 2011, you know, the one that doxes you when you buy it, but pretty weird. It's a game with many different parts, many different factions and subgroups, and many different things that appeal to many different people. That's one of its greatest strengths, in my opinion. TF2, to me, proves more than any other game that you can in fact make a game that appeals to almost everybody, as long as you have that strong, fundamental, deep base to work from. For the Tryhards, TF2 has some of the best design of any shooter ever, incredible mechanics, and really fun things to do. And for everybody else, there's funny ragdolls and taunts to enjoy. Most games get one down or the other perfectly, but not both. This is why I think TF2 YouTube does so well. You can talk about mechanics while also showing off funny, goofy stuff, appealing to a wide audience, even from one single creator. And I think that's largely how I've found success here as well. You can make a lot of things that appeal to many different kinds of people, and I think all those different kinds of people are what make the TF2 community at times seem a little divisive. When a lot of different players are coming to your game for different things, sometimes those things that they're coming for are going to be contradictory to what other players want. The community isn't always going to vibe together, but I think that no two groups in TF2's history have ever vibed so little or caused more division recently than the Big Two. I'm of course referring to some of the most ancient clans in all of Team Fortress, the Tryhards, and the Casuals. Ever since the Barbary Wars, when their ancestors battled over the high seas, these two groups have been chronicled as being in some kind of a conflict. We always talk about them as if they're two distinct groups that never get along no matter what. And even though I personally think that's partially not totally true, like yeah, the fringes and the extremes of each group don't get along, but I think most players exist somewhere in the middle ground and can get along with most other players. But I also have to admit, this division is reaching what seems like a fevered pitch. These days, the TF2 community seems like it can't do anything but fight with itself and try to wrangle Valve's attention, at least when they're not having sex with children. Everything you do in this game is wrong to somebody. Do you like certain cosmetics? Well, you're ruining the game's art. Do you like certain taunts? Well, you must be baiting. Nobody could actually like that, cause I don't. Is your Merc badge not from when I want it to be? You're a new-gen tourist who has no idea what you're saying. Do you not hate every update that I hate? You like slop. It's honestly kind of whack for a game that's effectively gasping for its last breaths for the community to have so many problems with one another. If you're not aware, Team Fortress 2 was given a relatively unceremonious curtain call by Valve. The last two big updates were, in this order, kind of bad, and not really bad, but not really great. And in those 8 years since, the community has been steeping in anger. And since the community knows damn well that Valve is not about to give a shit about them, they've decided to turn inward for their conflict. And sadly, a small tertiary group has been caught in the crossfire. A group that often goes unheard, but not unknown. One that goes unseen, but not unconsidered. You know who I'm talking about, chat. No, not werewolves. I'm talking about the comp players. The story of comp TF2 is a very annoying tale. TF2 grinders spent years trying to get recognition and help from Valve, the same way that Valve was supporting two other competitive games, to no avail. As such, the competitive community for TF2 went through a state of turmoil for a long time. Before 2016, it was a third-party thing that you saw YouTubers talk about on occasion and was generally regarded as what Tryhards did when they wanted to nut up and stop just pub-stomping noobs. There were a lot of noteworthy members of the community that just so happened to passively bridge the gap between competitive players and the average Team Fortress 2 player. It was simply more normalized. It was just a thing people did. These days, TF2's competitive side is treated like a pariah. If you were to ask the average Team Fortress 2 player, or more accurately people who pretend to play Team Fortress 2 while commenting on YouTube, competitive players are responsible for many of the things that ruined Team Fortress 2. And of course, I'm not here to say that you can't have that opinion. If you don't want to play comp or you don't like comp players for whatever reason, that's fine. The problem I have is that a lot of things that are objectively not true are being treated as if they're facts, just because like a YouTuber said so, or because they've been repeated so many times that nobody wants to be the guy who stands up and questions if that's really how things are. And the outrage has started to spread not just to competitive players, but to tryhards, anybody who does anything cool, and even people beyond that. There are many things that contribute to Team Fortress 2's current status. A lack of care by the developers, simple age, bad updates, a loss of many of the game's best voices, Valatrax the Trickster Demon, and also classic Valve lack of communication. But one thing that I know pretty much for certain now that I've gone through and actually researched it, is that competitive players are not responsible for why TF2 is the way it is, and I think it would be remiss of me to have the platform that I have, even though this is a modest channel, and not use it for some kind of good, because the longer I don't say something, the more things that aren't true will continue to be true. So we're going to go over all of the different arguments, or at least all of the major arguments I've seen against comp players, and we're going to talk about why many of them are either just wrong, or are based on very loose interpretations of actual events, and why, surprise surprise, it might actually be Valve who's responsible for their game. That's right, not Charlemagne, but Valve. Cause I can feel ya. Now, this one here is my favorite claim, and that's why I put it first. And it's my favorite because it's just a baseless assumption that people have decided is a fact. It's like those people who've been saying that I'm secretly an alien who's infiltrating the entertainment industry to prepare for the invasion. Like, can you believe what some people think? And thinking that Team Fortress 2 was meant to be inherently casual is just as foolish. In fact, it's so foolish, I don't even need to get into the arguments of how Team Fortress 2 works yet, because unfortunately for anybody who says this, Robin Walker exists. If you're a TF2 player and you don't know who Robin Walker is, that's a shame, because he's the mastermind not just behind our game, but also behind the failed 1991 bombing of the Ponte Milvio. But he's more well known for being like the guy behind Team Fortress 2. He was one of the original 2 and then 3 developers for Team Fortress Quake, and he was also one of the design leads on Team Fortress Classic and Team Fortress 2, among a bunch of other Valve games. Basically everything, funnily enough, except for CSGO. So obviously, Robin Walker, who is one of the originators of Team Fortress 2 not just as a game, but as a series, and who must reflect most of its most important qualities into his work, should be a huge casual, right? Anyway, here's a bit from the interview that preceded the Pro Players vs. Valve Devs exhibition match that Valve participated in 2008, where Robin Walker was the team leader of Team Valve.
Cheating? So then what's the Valve strategy going to be for tonight's match? Are you going to bust out some developer hacks, no clip, possibly an aimbot, little down dirty things going on?
No, I don't think we're gonna do that sort of stuff. We had a lot of fun doing that back in the Half-Life 2 CTF match we did a couple of years ago. But I think tonight we're planning to hopefully play a good game and sort of see what TF is like at the sort of highest level. And that's sort of really the reason why we wanted to do this in the first place. You know, when you guys sort of started the tournament, we felt like this was a way we could get a sort of a bit of a window into how the top level guys are playing, which is really valuable for us when it comes to designing the game. You know, as we continue to do the ongoing support work for TF2 and so on, we really want to make sure we're supporting what a game that these guys want to play, and the best way we can do that is to get a really good sort of sense of how they play it. And I don't think there's any way we can get a better sense of how they play it than going out there and playing them at it.
And that's something only the most casual of game designers would do, is play in a tournament against high-level players with the expressed purpose of getting their feedback and using it to design the game. But if that's not enough, here's a 2010 interview on Community Fortress where Robin Walker talks about how the team used to have a competent 12-man team that could be worked down to a 6-man team if they wanted to, and that there are several people on the TF team, I assume, who've played competitively for various FPSs. And I'm sure their experience playing those games competitively had absolutely no influence on their game design whatsoever. And later on in the same paragraph, he says that Valve don't consider themselves good proxies for the competitive side of the game, so we need to listen to the competitive players themselves when trying to measure the impact of changes on their play. This same interview talks a lot about competitive players, and adding things that competitive players want for the sake of quality of life, like server settings. Here's another interview in 2010 from the Critscast where Robin Walker says that he occasionally scrimmages, and has comp players on his Steam friends list. Here's an interview he did with the 1UP Show in 2007, either right before or right after the release of the game, I can't tell, where Robin Walker explains why grenades were removed from Team Fortress 2 coming over from Team Fortress 1.
The grenades are often so effective that you know, they were one of the ways that people were winning games. One of the secondary reasons were they were the largest source of spam in the game. We don't like spam for a variety of reasons. We don't think it's not terribly skill-based, and it's also very confusing to new players usually in that they die and they're not really sure exactly what killed them.
And of course, only the most casual games out there care about a player's skill. Here's a 2012 interview where Robin Walker talks about implementing the Left 4 Dead matchmaking into Team Fortress 2 for the purposes of competitive pickup games. Now, this is already like 5 examples, and using any more would be belaboring the point. So here's the Summer Sizzler, a 2001 exhibition match played between pro players and various big community members, including YouTubers and again, Robin Walker. Alright, I will stop, but the point is, if Team Fortress 2 was never supposed to have a competitive bone in its body, it's really weird that Valve knew about the competitive scene, participated in competitive matches, promoted tournaments on the blog and made little medals for things, and took competitive feedback in mind. And we're not talking post-2016 or some shit. All of this is from either 2008 to like 2012. And if you want me to talk more about interviews that happened after this period, don't worry, I've got more. But I think you get the point. Valve was very thoroughly aware of competitive Team Fortress 2. Competitive Team Fortress 2 is entwined with the game. The leagues and the formats started right when the game released. There hasn't been a moment, except maybe like the beta, when these two things weren't inseparable and its influence wasn't impactful. Now, some people might be trying to switch around what they said. They might say, oh, we didn't mean that Team Fortress 2 is an uncompetitive game, but more so that it wasn't meant to have a competitive league. And you're right, they probably weren't prepared for that. In fact, most games release not knowing whether or not they're going to have a player base at all, whether or not they're going to make their money back, and whether or not they're just going to be dead on arrival. It is in fact only very few companies that have the luxury and the resources to prepare for a tournament scene before their game is even successful. And sometimes even that doesn't work. So you're right, they probably didn't know that that was going to happen. That does not really mean anything, and does not mean that you cannot support your scene, or that the existence of the scene cannot influence you. It also doesn't make it illegitimate. Street Fighter is a game that has one of the most successful tournament circuits in the entire history of games. Even where other esports have failed, Street Fighter and other fighting games like Tekken, Smash, etc. have been able to bring in dozens of times their player base and viewership for their events, which I imagine Capcom back in 1994 were not very prepared for because esports didn't exist yet, and also in the first version of Street Fighter 2 you couldn't even play the same character as your opponent, so you had to do a fucking coin flip to see who got to play Guile. That did not stop anybody from realizing that the depth for a competitive game was there. Much like the giant autonomous drill that's slowly digging a sinkhole big enough to finally swallow the city of Adelaide, your game's competitive viability is there whether you like it or not. Let's make up a hypothetical here where absolutely none of Team Fortress 2's gameplay was designed to be competitive, which isn't true, but let's pretend that it is. If competitive players are like illegitimate or wrong or whatever because they're playing the game in an unintended way, then why aren't friendlies treated with the same vitriol? Think about it, what has the TF team ever added to support the playstyle, if you can call it that, of friendlies? There's no friendly items, there's no friendly mode, there's no friendly only queuing. You might say, oh, what about the holiday punch? Which, you know, still does damage and is really useful for killing people since it can stuff Ubers and rewards you for hitting opponents in a specific way, and even the little update blurb that added the holiday punch mentions that all of the new community weapons in that update, which was Australian Christmas 2011, were going to be used by players to bludgeon each other to death, which doesn't sound very friendly to me. But wait a second, what about two-person team-agnostic taunts? How could I have missed those, and why is it that when I finally include them, it's very unorganically and clearly much later because my microphone has changed? Is it because I had something that I wanted to say and then forgot for a month and a half, or is it because of the Sand People? But that is true. Generally speaking, team-agnostic taunts are very friendly. But A, the first one of those wasn't added until 4 years after the game came out and 3 years after tournament mode, and also the ability to high-five the enemy didn't come out till 3 years after that. And you know, not to be like a dick or anything, but when we're talking about the original intention of something, I don't think you can really bring up things that were changed 7 years after it released. I mean, the mere fact that you can go and shoot the enemies probably tells you that Valve didn't intend for you to not do that. One Valve developer in 2017 even said in an interview with Uncle Dane that they don't really understand why people play as friendlies. So Valve probably wasn't really prepared for people to sit in a corner and throw sandwiches at their enemies. Does that mean that it is now an illegitimate playstyle and that you shouldn't be allowed to do it? No, of course not. A lot of people may not like friendlies, like I'm not friendlies' biggest fan either, I think a lot of them are pretty hypocritical, but I would never tell somebody they can't do it or that it's illegitimate. I don't think you should do it, I think you should go and help your team, but I don't think you can can't. And even though Valve wasn't prepared for and in no way supports the playstyle, I think that most people generally agree with me on friendlies. They either don't really mind them or they like them. They're treated as TF2's darling little player base. But comp players, for doing effectively the same thing, playing in a way that Valve didn't sign off on, even though they're in their own servers, are ruining the game in the process of doing so. Friendlies don't even have that much decency, and they do their nonsense on public servers. They're out here wasting people's team slots. They're not capping the point like Valve wants them to. And of course, that's the point. That's perfectly fine. Like, are gun spies doing something wrong because they're not going for stabs the way Spy was designed to be? Are Fat Scouts doing something wrong because they're not using their miniguns like Heavy was supposed to? No, of course not. That's complete nonsense. What they're doing might not be effective, and they're probably going to lose, or at least not win as hard as they could if they were playing their classes with their full loadout, but there's nothing, like, wrong with it. It doesn't hurt the game in any way. Outside of course, cheating or just stabbing your opponent if you see them in real life, it doesn't really matter how you play the game. But all of this operates under the massive assumption that Valve wasn't aware of competitive gaming and didn't want you to play Team Fortress 2 at a high level, which even if you just look at the mechanics of the game is clearly wrong. Whenever I see people talk about Team Fortress 2 being a casual game, they either just say that and then don't elaborate, or they say that there are clear core mechanics in Team Fortress 2 that show that the game isn't interested in competition. The most commonly cited ones being random damage variation, random crits, and random shotgun pellet spread. And that because competitive leagues remove these mechanics, obviously they are altering Team Fortress 2 at its core and are no longer playing the same game. But personally speaking, I don't think any of these mechanics were very core to Team Fortress 2 at any point, and I don't think that in some ways these mechanics are as anti-competitive as they're made out to be. Now, one of the ones I definitely have to concede is random damage spread. It would be a little bit difficult to take a game with this mechanic seriously, which is probably why Valve removed it from their servers. And the loss of this important mechanic was so bad for Team Fortress 2 that everybody got up and cheered once it happened, because this was the dumbest fucking mechanic that has ever entered this game. And I would argue that even though it was there for a long time, it was very antithetical to the core design of TF2. If you look at the damage thresholds for Team Fortress 2, you notice that they are very intentionally and specifically designed for certain things to kill certain classes. It's not a coincidence that Demoman just so happens to kill a base heavy in exactly 3 pipes, and no more. It's not a coincidence that Sniper just so happens to be able to one-tap a medic, who is the most important class for him to be able to pick. A character who's behind a lot of other characters and protected by their team, which is something Sniper does very well at killing. And it's not a coincidence that the base damage of the rocket launcher just so happens to be 10 damage under exactly what it would need to be able to, say, 2-shot a soldier or 3-shot a heavy. It's like they wanted to incentivize you to go fight your enemies in close range and take advantage of some kind of a ramping up mechanic or something to push you just over the edge. And because the damage thresholds of Team Fortress 2 are so razor sharp, like it's exactly 3 pills for a base heavy, removing a little bit of damage or adding a little bit of damage often A, does nothing because you still like 2-pipe somebody or whatever, but also it serves no purpose other than to fuck with the threshold for no reason. It takes a very well designed part of Team Fortress 2 and stomps on it. This had no place in the game, even if Valve said it does. Random pellet spread is one of the 2 surviving mechanics, and it's somewhat similar. Shotguns on Valve servers even today have a random spread of pellets. And frankly, as somebody who plays a lot of Uncletopia, which has a fixed pellet spread, and a lot of Valve servers which have random pellet spread, I don't really notice much of a difference. But just like the intangible 4th dimensional aliens that occasionally move things around your house just to see if they can't drive you crazy, just because you don't notice something doesn't mean you're not being affected by it. It's very well documented that random spread does do stuff, but even so, I don't personally think that it does impactful enough stuff, consistently enough, to be granted the title of core mechanic. There are simply a lot of situations where this does nothing, like your RNG simply not changing the amount of shots it takes to kill somebody, not even mentioning the fact that 4 classes don't have shotguns, and 3 of the classes that do have shotguns don't always bring one. Not to mention again that this mechanic is optional, and when you turn it off, nothing in the game seems to magically break down. This is why quite a few community servers just turn this off, and again, I don't think that many people notice. In fact, I don't think most players even notice the long distended finger that comes out of their closet and instantly vanishes once you turn around, or the presence of random spread, and that's not even talking about the fact that a lot of very successful esports that are very deep and people really like have random pellet spread for their shotguns or other guns. And frankly, I don't see how such a minor detail possibly invalidates everything else about these games that makes them deep. In fact, let's do a little exercise. You give me the runic symbol that unlocks Gelgramoth's holy tomb and I will not feed you to my horde of goblins. goblins. But if not that, then you go ahead and you go talk to the CS2 community and you try to convince them and all of the money they make and all of their pro players and all of their rank grinders and all of the giant tournaments they host that the game doesn't count as a competitive game because the XM has random spread. You will not be laughed at and called really fucking stupid for having a really fucking stupid and laughable opinion. And that leaves us with the Mac Daddy of them all, random crits. Now, whether or not random crits are good for Team Fortress 2 is a tale as old as time. It is possibly one of the oldest and most prevalent discourses that this game has ever had. But frankly, I don't think random crits in any way count as a core mechanic for Team Fortress 2, and I also don't think they're nearly as anti-competitive as people have made them out to be. But I think to really talk about this correctly, we have to define what a core mechanic is. And I think I'm going to give you an example of what I think a core mechanic is and why I think it is one. Street Fighter 6 is the newest of the Street Fighters, and it brought with it a mechanic called the drive gauge. The drive gauge is a resource that every player, pretty much no matter what they're doing, is always going to either be affected by or use directly in some way in every match of the game. For one thing, many of the new mechanics that came with the game require drive gauge to perform, including drive rush, drive impact, parry, and drive reversal. And it's also the resource you spend to do meter versions of your moves. Offensively speaking, the game is entirely built under the assumption that these mechanics exist. Many characters have their frame data and their moves designed around the idea that they're going to be using drive rush to extend their block strings. Without it, pressure situations go from looking like this to this. As you can see, it's not quite as exciting, and defense isn't really any different. A lot of moves and characters in this game are designed with the idea that the opponent can use drive gauge to keep themselves safe, especially from very specific moves that are otherwise difficult to deal with. For example, Ken has this stupid full-screen jumpy kicky bullshit. Even in the game now, this move is already pretty difficult to deal with at times. But if you have your wits about you and you're not currently under the effects of the Banshee's pendulum, you can deal with it without too much of a headache. Even discounting character-specific answers, you can always hit this with a drive impact if you're really prepared for it, or if you react kinda late, you can perfect parry it. But without the ability to use these tools and the drive bar, not only do you miss out on this stuff, you lose out on a lot of character-specific answers as well. So dealing with moves like the kicky bullshit become way more inconsistent, not to mention more difficult and less rewarding in a lot of cases. Which means that characters that have moves like this become the haves, and characters that don't become the have-nots. Street Fighter 6, by all accounts, is a very well-balanced game, and the reason for this is largely because all of these characters have access to these universal mechanics. Without them, some characters are going to become incredibly mediocre, and others would become much more powerful and much more popular because they're more complete without the drive gauge. And even just discounting all of the ways in which the game is designed around drive gauge, you can't escape it. No matter what you do, hitting certain moves or being hit by or blocking certain moves changes how much drive gauge you have. And drive gauge acts sort of like a guard meter. Once you run out, your character becomes incredibly nerfed. And these two things in combination are what I think make this a core mechanic. Large portions of the game are designed with it in mind and don't really work as well without it, and also it's always present. You can't escape it. And that simply is not what random crits are or have ever been or ever will be. For one thing, there are simply a lot of scenarios in which random crits just don't do anything. Firstly, they don't happen all of the time because they're random, and also even when they do happen, there's a lot of situations where somebody misses with their random crit and wastes it, or uses it for something like a rocket jump where it doesn't actually do anything, or they kill somebody who was already going to die to a regular shot anyway. So even discounting what random crits are designed to do, I'm not really positive I would call something that does nothing much of the time a core mechanic to the game, especially one which doesn't have very much of the game being designed around it. Like, what about this game actually references random crits in any form? There's like the crit bucket, which is an anti-cheating measure more than it is like a game mechanic, I would argue. And then there's the weapons that have no random crits listed as a negative, which is really funny because that means that one of the only things that references random crits in the entire game turns them off. Not to mention the fact that turning off random crits is such a minor downside for a weapon that not only do a lot of people argue it really isn't one, especially if you're on a no crits server, but also Valve experimented with removing no random crits from certain weapons like the Southern Hospitality and giving them a real downside, and then immediately reverted the change because I think they realized literally any actual downside is way worse than no random crits, and they were nerfing the dog shit out of these weapons. But also, random crits were not designed to be anti-competitive in any way. Valve has outlined very distinctly how random crits work, and if you actually look at how they are designed, they're not there to like stop strong players or whatever. The way random crits work is that they are awarded more frequently to people who are doing well, especially if you do a lot of damage in a short time. And generally speaking, the people who are going to be doing the most damage are the best players. Like it or not, random crits are there to promote and reward the best players for doing well and to help them do even better. You can see this if you go on a killing spree with like Demo or somebody else who has a lot of ammo and can do a lot of damage. You get crits out the ass. Crits aren't there to make the game fair or balanced because they're not fair because some people get more than others because of how good they are at the game, and they're not balanced because Soldier and Demo Man benefit from crits way more than any other class. They're there to incentivize players to push when they have killed a bunch of guys, which is a fundamental part of playing a competitive shooter very well. If you're playing a 5v5 game and your team kills 2 guys, you have very few reasons not to push your advantage because now you have more dudes. This is called taking space. And random crits aren't just there to help you learn how to take space, they're also there to help good players cleave through the madness that is caused by having 12 people on each team. It's a lot easier for good players to carry their team when the game randomly instantly kills people that they might not have killed otherwise. And of course, this isn't even mentioning that random crits, like they're crits, they improve your damage. They only do something when you go and fight the other guys. In fact, many of Team Fortress 2's best, deepest, and most competitive mechanics are designed and in place to get you to go fight the other guys. And even if you don't believe me when I say that, even though I'm just reciting facts to you, Valve themselves have said this.
So the way the crits work, it sums up the amount of damage you've done in the last 20 seconds, and the more damage you've done, the higher your crit chance is, and it caps out, I think it's around 20%. And so what this means is as you do well, you essentially are earning a very short-term bonus. You know, if you happen to kill 2 or 3 enemies in rapid succession, then it means you have, you know, somewhere less than 20 seconds of bonus right now that you really should go and use. And if you hang back right now or go on the defensive, then you're sort of wasting this short-term bonus. And so it's a large offensive incentive essentially. And you know, in our interior playtests and so on, where everyone understands exactly how they work, we see a lot of positive results of that. So, you know.
And mind you, this isn't even mentioning the fact that, unlike many other mechanics in Team Fortress 2, Valve intended for you to be able to just turn these ones off. Not only are they a simple server variable that allows you to directly turn off random crits, random pellet spread, and random damage, which don't exist for other mechanics like air strafing, or air shots, or the fact that Scout himself is designed to be a high-skill character, and which might imply that Valve probably didn't think these mechanics were particularly popular or very important. If they were important, they probably wouldn't let you turn them off. And mind you, this isn't just a server variable just for your custom servers. Back in the good old days of quick play, there used to be a dedicated button to search for servers that didn't have random crits. There was no hiding it. Valve intended for you to be able to turn off this mechanic because it's not very important and a lot of people don't like it for very good reasons. So let's take a step back and look at these 3 mechanics again. We have 3, not even now because it's 2, mechanics which are so negligible that a lot of the time they don't do anything, and Valve put a giant fucking button on the server browser that allowed you to turn them off, and at least for one of them wasn't even designed to stop competition in any capacity. If that is what makes a mechanic core to Team Fortress 2, then I don't know how you look at the dozens of other mechanics, but not just mechanics, character designs and weapon designs in this game that reward skill and deep gameplay, all of which you can't turn off. Like, for example, damage fall-off, without which the game would be terrible. TF2 would become a game that is played incredibly safely and cowardly, with people poking at each other from across the map instead of getting into each other's faces and having bombastic fights and maybe kissing a little bit like we have now. And if that's not good enough, it would probably be really bad for heavy. Or air strafing, which I've mentioned a couple of times because it is a very important universal mechanic, and without it this game would be ass. ass. Every single type of advanced movement in this game would die right on the spot, and so would any loadouts or strategies that depend on them. Or what about something like damage surfing, which allows knowledgeable players to escape bad situations if their timing and movement are good enough? There's no particular reason to add a mechanic like that. In fact, I think TF2 is the only game I know of that has it. Seems like the kind of thing you only add if you wanted higher skill players to be able to avoid danger. But I don't think anything at TF2's core really showcases that this game is inherently competitive more than the relationship between the weapon design and the movement. People know generally that Team Fortress 2 is pretty fast, or it can be pretty fast. We all know about rocket jumping, sticky jumping, det jumping, whatever. But I don't think a lot of people know just how fast and how universally fast Team Fortress 2 really is. Soldier is the second slowest class in the game, at least by walk speed, but even Soldier's walk speed is only a little bit slower than a CSGO player is when they're running with their knife out. And running with your knife out is one of the fastest things you can do in CS outside of like boosting. So even just going by walking, which is about the slowest thing that Soldier can do, our second slowest character is just about as fast as a CS player can be. TF2 is simply a very fast game, and what goes really well with a game with fast movement is burst damage weapons. Unlike a lot of its contemporaries, Team Fortress 2's primary weapons are not bullet hose assault rifles, and this is really integral to the design of Team Fortress 2 because bullet hose assault rifles, surprise surprise, make it really easy to track people. After all, they're tracking weapons. You can see this exact phenomenon with a couple of weapons in Team Fortress 2 as well, the minigun, the flamethrower, the SMG, and the pistol. But those examples only really highlight the point. It's really easy to deal consistent damage to someone, even if they're moving extremely well, because the short durations between shots means that small adjustments or short windows of missing are largely unpunishing. You can miss, of course, but it doesn't really matter if you do miss because you're just gonna get to shoot another shot almost immediately afterwards. And this is precisely why the minigun, the flamethrower, and the pistol at least work the way that they do. The pistol is designed to make it so that if you stay in combat for a couple of seconds, you can do enough damage very easily to be able to clean up your kills that you might not have finished off with the scattergun. The minigun and the flamethrower, of course, are also designed specifically to make it really easy to hit people even if they're going really fast. And because of this, the dynamics between TF2's movement and shooting are higher skill and much more rewarding for good players than I think any other FPS game since. The only games that get anywhere close are like Quake and other arena shooters because they're just so fast, and Fistful of Frags and Hunt Showdown, two games that adopt the same burst damage style of weapon design and are pretty good at it. And these types of weapons, which only have like 4 to 6 shots, or like 8 if you have the airstrike, they're much more committal. If you aren't aiming exactly where you need to be right when you fire, you're going to miss your entire shot. This means that your movement can be incredibly disruptive to your opponent. Because you can dodge almost all of their damage at once and not just a portion of their magazine, good players who are making themselves difficult to hit and who are acting as an unpredictable target can avoid an insane amount of damage. More so in this game than I think almost any other FPS. And even though good movement is so powerful in this game, weapon design comes right around to meet it. Do you ever wonder why Team Fortress 2 is filled with so many weapons that in some way bloom around the center of where you're aiming? Like how the rocket launcher deals less damage the further away from the impact point you are, or how the shotgun can hit partial connects if you're not aiming exactly at somebody because you hit a couple of the pellets. Well, it's not just because, it's actually for two very good reasons. For one thing, in a game that's this fast, it allows you to hit partial damage on people if they're moving very well. That way you're not just completely hopeless if you're not only hitting direct shots. But also, it more heavily rewards players who are capable of hitting those direct shots. And again, in a game where your mag size is like 4 or 6, that's really important. That's the difference between being able to two-shot most of the cast as a soldier, or having to use most of your magazine on somebody that you shouldn't have to use most of your magazine on, and then not having enough rockets to kill somebody else. And this design even reflects in weapons that don't allow you to hit partial hits, like the grenade launcher, which I guess technically lets you hit rollers, but which often does nothing if you're not hitting direct pipes. If you're capable of making good predictions on where your opponents are going to move, you can get huge rewards from landing direct shots with multiple weapons in the game, dealing enough damage to be able to kill several enemies per magazine, especially for characters like Scout. This combination is what gives TF2 its unique type of neutral. This dynamic is at the center of every fight in Team Fortress 2, unless you're like both playing heavy or some shit. And in my opinion, it is one of the most considerate and skillful and rewarding relationships that these two mechanics have compared to any other FPS game. And this isn't even talking about things like character design or weapon design. There are a lot of parts of characters, and a lot of characters just in general, that are built to be scalable skillful. I mean, Scout's entire character design is to be incredibly fragile, but very powerful in the right hands if somebody can avoid damage and aim well. Spy is another inherently skillful character. You have to get behind the enemy team as a character that can just be deleted if anybody looks at you the wrong way, and be able to make important picks for your team without just like stabbing one pyro and then dying. That's not even to mention the like 6,000 different stabs and how to surf and all that other stuff you have to learn to really be a pub stomper spy. Demo Man needs to be able to hit pipes directly and needs to be knowledgeable about how he uses his sticky bombs. He needs to know good places for traps, when to start sticky spamming, and how to use them to dissuade people from just rushing him down, especially scouts. And Sniper, by design, is a character that isn't really effective unless you're hitting headshots. And of course there's more, but this isn't even talking about how these characters were later changed through updates. Pyro getting the flare gun, and then the flare gun getting made into a weapon that rewards accuracy. Medic getting the crossbow, Engineer getting who knows how many different weapons that all do some kind of cool thing and allow him to do really cool rollouts or get behind the enemy team or build his buildings in places that he normally couldn't. Spy getting the Ambassador. Scout getting items like the Force of Nature, which double as a movement option. Soldier gets a lot of them. He's got the Airstrike, which not only allows you to do really cool rocket jumps, but is also just objectively harder to hit with. He's got the Beggar's Bazooka, which is just like a crazy weapon that is almost entirely defined by the skill of the user, and then he also has like the Market Gardener, which is a weapon that is literally entirely defined by the skill of the user. There is so much in this game that either rewards you for going and killing people or rewards you for going and killing people well that I just cannot understand how people don't think this game was meant in some capacity to be played at a high level. For some people, however, the smoking gun for the idea that Team Fortress 2 wasn't supposed to be competitive in any way are the differences between its casual and competitive formats, with most people referencing team sizes, weapon bans, and class limits, because, as we all know, Valve decided on 12v12 for the default team size, and that as a result, because Sixes and Highlander are played with fewer people, they're not real Team Fortress 2. And I have to admit, there's a lot of truth to this statement. Valve does in fact use a 12v12 format for their default servers. My question, however, is so what? Yes, Valve chose 12v12 for their PC servers. They also chose 8v8 for their console servers, and I don't think that was for gameplay reasons. I think that's because the Xbox 360 probably didn't do a very good job of running 24 people on the screen. And of course, because Valve thought that anything less than 12v12 was not real legitimate TF2, they allowed you to make a server with any team size that you want up to 50v50. But even beyond that, I don't necessarily think that 12v12 or higher team sizes are as anti-competitive as people make them out to be. I mean, Highlander is 9v9 and you're more than halfway there at that point, but also from what I can gather, multiple different team sizes were playtested back in 2007 and early 2008, including 8v8, 7v7, eventually settling on 6v6, mostly just because it's a lot easier to get a game to run. Getting 12 adults with conflicting schooling or work or family schedules to do anything all at one time is really difficult. Getting 24 adults to do that is probably almost impossible. Even Highlander, which is 18 people, has to use a lot of substitutions to get games to fire. Of course, I do think any attempt at competitive 12v12 would be highly flawed, but I don't think that any of the things that make competitive sixes fun fundamentally don't exist in 12v12 as well. All the skillful parts are still there, it's just occasionally you get hit with Girardi. You can still make callouts, you can still be a shot caller, and you still have to aim and position well. All the characters that are strong in 6s are still strong in 12s, and team coordination is still really powerful. In fact, it only takes like 3 coordinated decent players to completely mulch a casual team. Again, there would certainly be problems, but the parts that make competitive Team Fortress 2 competitive don't just magically vanish. Additionally, I've never had it explained to me how less than 12 people on each team makes it no longer real TF2. I guess if you ever play casual and the server doesn't fill up immediately and you're playing like a 6v7 or something like that, you're not playing real TF2, you're a poser. And very conveniently, nobody ever bothers arguing whether or not 50v50 is legitimate because Redditors are too busy falling for the same exact engagement bait for the 500th week in a row to worry about that. But either way, this stupid gatekeeping nonsense aside, games having different formats for their competitive leagues is not new and it's not weird. Those of you who have played 2 whole video games in your entire life might come up with examples like Magic the Gathering, which has a bunch of different formats for different kinds of play. And many of these formats turned out to be really fun, and a lot of them provide something different for different types of players so that everybody can enjoy the game. And even within Valve games, this is nothing new. Counter-Strike has massive differences between its casual and ranked modes, and I think it works out pretty well. Having differences in your formats to accommodate for different levels of seriousness is not that strange and is generally a pretty good idea. I certainly wouldn't agree with the idea that a game has no competitive validity just because it has to make some some changes to its competitive format. Some people might argue that TF2 makes too many changes, but I don't really agree with that either. One of the bigger pain points people claim to have about competitive TF2 is the being that lurks within the cave, but also with class limits. And I do have to concede that class limits are definitely one of the biggest differences between casual and competitive TF2. Obviously, TF2 distinctly allows you to play any number of classes during normal gameplay. And this is actually pretty unique for Team Fortress 2, because I can't think of a single other game that has characters as distinctly designed as this game does that allow you to stack multiple of them. Fighting games don't, even ones that allow you to play in teams. I'm not aware of any MOBA now or in the past that allowed you to do that, at least one that people actually played. And I'm also not aware of any hero shooters, again, now or in the past outside of Overwatch that allowed you to do this. And Overwatch took away that functionality pretty quick, because as it turns out, you can just stack multiples of characters that are problematic and cause a lot of problems. In fact, even casual Team Fortress 2 suffers a little bit from class stacking, assuming people know what they're doing. Edgy stacking is probably the most dreaded of them all because it allows engineers, especially on certain maps, to build unassailable nests that never run out of people to repair them. Heavy stacks on payload with proper medic support are also pretty annoying, especially since the easiest way for an individual player to deal with them without having to ask their team to help them, which is fucking impossible, is to just play sniper, and then because that guy's playing sniper, if they're any good, that means the enemy team is going to start playing sniper to counter-snipe him. And now not only is the lobby filled with a bunch of pocket heavies, it's filled with a bunch of snipers who are trying to kill the pocket heavies, and no one's having any more fun. So the fact that there are class limits in comp really shouldn't surprise anybody. But also, a lot of class limits are, again, completely league dependent, and aren't there because the game is inherently uncompetitive the moment you have 2 heavies or whatever. Like, RGL, from what I can find, limits sniper to 1 per team, largely because people just really don't like him. Sixes allows for multiples of like half of the cast. Soldiers, scouts, pyros, and spies can all be played in 2 ofs, which is pretty unique among hero shooters, which again usually limit you to 1 per character. And also, that's only talking about sixes. Some formats have class limits just because that's what the format is and that's why people want to play it. Highlander is 1 of every character on each team, 9v9. And the reason that has class limits is not because the game falls apart the moment there's 3 spies or something, it's because that's the whole point of the format. That's why people want to play it. They want to play 1 of each character. But again, I don't think anybody actually cares about this as much as they just want to bitch about something, because very few people seem to know what classes aren't allowed or how many are allowed, with multiple people I've seen suggesting that comp players ban classes, which is not true across any major league. But also, when these tournament circuits happen to ever play without class restrictions, nobody comes out to support it, even though apparently this is the one thing that would really allow a lot of people to get into comp TF2. And yes, tournaments without restrictions of any kind have happened multiple times. RGL has hosted, I believe, 2 separate no restrictions 6s seasons. And this drums up absolutely no attention from the greater Team Fortress 2 community, because the greater Team Fortress 2 community doesn't actually care if you ban classes, they just want to complain about something. And as far as Valve's role in all of this goes, maybe Valve did intend for people to play whichever classes they want whenever they want, but it sure didn't take them even a year to add a tournament mode which has class limit functionality built right into it. And a lot of the same stuff goes for weapon bans. If you don't know, every single comp TF2 league, and in every single format except I guess no restrictions, bans at least a couple of the weapons in the game. Exactly how many and which weapons are banned is dependent on the league and format, but they always have at least a couple of weapon bans. And people often blow this entire thing way out of proportion by saying that competitive players ban like half of the arsenal to try to force TF2 to be competitive, because it's naturally not. And maybe back in like 2015, when the weapon ban list here in America was 80 weapons, that might have been true. But these days, that's a total load of horseshit, and within the context of a grassroots community, weapon bans make a lot of sense. Weapon bans are done by people who run these leagues, people with biases or who might be making mistakes. For a long time, a bunch of heavy weapons were banned that allowed heavy to get around faster, because there was a concern that heavy to mid was a very powerful strategy that would ruin 6s. Heavy, like we talked about earlier, has his minigun, and the minigun is really good at killing people from moving very fast. The 6's metagame is a lot like the core design of TF2 itself. It's built around a lot of fast movement and burst damage weapons, neither of which Heavy has, and one of which at least Heavy severely punishes. So 6's players for a very long time didn't want him to be a part of the game. I mean, back in the day, he almost had every single one of his weapons banned. But as the league has progressed, many of the restrictions placed on Heavy have been lifted, and now the only things that are banned on the class are Natasha and the Fists of Steel. This includes things like the Gru and the Buffalo Steak Sandwich, 2 items that allow Heavy to get to mid really quickly, because as it turns out, Heavy to mid isn't as powerful as everybody thought it was. It wasn't that Heavy was inherently anti-competitive and was ruining the scene, it's just that people thought he might do that. And that's simply what happens when you have a bunch of players who are running the league. But again, also, it's a player-run grassroots league. If there's a weapon ban you don't like, you can just go make your own league or go play in somebody else's. After then, you would be free to ban or not ban whatever it is you want, because Team Fortress is not the only game that bans things for its higher levels of play. MOBAs are fairly noteworthy for this. Every MOBA that I know of has a pick and ban system, even just for ranked, which becomes a part of the strategy before the match has even really started. MOBAs are games with incredibly harsh matchups at times, and pick bans allow you to circumvent these matchups at the cost of maybe not getting rid of a character that is overall more powerful. Not to mention, you can also bait your opponents into banning the wrong characters, or into thinking that you're going to do one strategy and having them ban characters that would stop that strategy when in reality you're doing something else. Trading card games often have ban lists full of cards that are problematic, and NBA 2025 events had to ban Jerry Ball Twister Johnson because of his sexual misconduct. It's really not that odd, and sometimes developers make mistakes, and those mistakes can't be corrected by the player base, so they have to ban something. Street Fighter Cross Tekken was a game made by Capcom in 2012, and it's a really cool game. I'll spare you the details, and from being forcibly conscripted into the pointless but brutal war that Texas and Louisiana are gonna have next week, but one of the worst mechanics in Street Fighter X Tekken is the gems. Gems are these powerful but passive effects that occur after certain conditions are met within the match, like hitting a certain type of move multiple times, or after you take a certain amount of damage, etc, etc. Gems are kind of neat, I guess, but what really wasn't neat was when Capcom decided to make a bunch of extremely powerful gems and then force you to pay money for them. And guess what? Modern Street Fighter X Tekken tournaments, all like one of them, restrict the DLC gems because it was really fucking stupid. And also, the only reason I think a lot of people consider bans to be so strange nowadays is because we live in the patching era and have for a long time. Instead of having to ban anything in any competitive format, now you just ask the devs to nerf it, or the devs collect a bunch of data from win rates or something and they nerf it on their own. And even though nerfs are a lot better than banning something outright, I don't think players asking for something to be nerfed from the developer and banning it in their own leagues are necessarily that different. In fact, I would argue banning a weapon in a league is probably a little bit better than nerfing it, because at the very least, when it's banned in the league, it doesn't affect anybody outside of the league, and you have to like agree to play in it, so what are you gonna do, complain? Oh wait, it's TF2, they're probably gonna complain. But again, this is really not as abnormal as people make it out to be. TF2 might be one of the only games where there's any real ban list, but it's also one of the only games where there could even be a ban list. A lot of modern games just don't have a grassroots tournament scene, it's all made by the developer, and developers avoid having to ban things or looking stupid by constantly rebalancing the game over and over at a ridiculous pace. This isn't even to mention the fact that a couple of different weapons aren't banned because they ruin the competitive integrity of the game. They're banned for some other tertiary reason. For example, for quite a while here in North America, the Gas Passer was banned in 6s. Now that sounds crazy, right? How could the Gas Passer be banned? They only ban overpowered weapons, and the Gas Passer is probably the weakest weapon in the entire game. And you're right, but the Gas Passer wasn't banned because it ruins the metagame or whatever, it was banned just because it was bugged. And RJL simply has a rule that states that severely bugged weapons aren't allowed in the format. And as such, the Gas Passer was banned, at least for a little while. What's hilarious about the Gas Passer is that it's so inconsequential that they decided to make an exception to that rule just to unban it, and it was never used anyway. And if weapons can be banned for reasons that have largely nothing to do with their competitive viability, and there's so few of them banned, I don't really see how this is a major slight against TF2's core design. And also, Team Fortress 2 was originally designed not to have any unlocks at all. That's why they're optional. I don't think the game is really that different with or without Girardi. And if you look at people play no restriction 6s, in the same game modes, the team compositions and the weapons used are pretty similar. It's just that teams run like 2 demo men and 2 medics when they get the chance because it's demo man and medic. Call me crazy, but I just don't think that these communities are criminal because they decided to question some of the decisions that Valve made with the game design of Team Fortress 2. And I know that's crazy because Valve is perfect and they've never added anything stupid like item sets that require cosmetics that cost money, but it might not be too weird to look at some of the weapons that Valve came up with and say, hey, This isn't really fun to play against, and I don't want to. And also, this gets into the wonderful world of developer intention, which largely doesn't fucking matter. Learning the thought process behind developer decisions is really interesting, and it can be very valuable for analyzing your game, but just cause the developers intend for you to do something doesn't mean you have to. Like, my twin brother Jim didn't intend to leave the beheaded corpse of a daycare teacher he thought was trafficking children in his trunk during that speeding ticket, but he did, and now my family expects me to donate to his commissary account? No, thank you. If your game has deep competitive gameplay, regardless of how much you need to change about it, people are going to go find and get it. The slam dunk example here is Smash Bros. Melee. Melee is one of the most beloved and honored competitive games there is right now, and this is largely to the chagrin of Nintendo, who did just about everything they could to make sure that that didn't happen, even though they failed. Masahiro Sakurai, the series creator, even went on record in 2015 saying that about Hungrybox and other professional Smash Melee players, "I wish that I could dump him into a hot tub full of boiling mercury." Safe to say, Nintendo has never really supported the competitive Smash scene. In fact, they've often actively tried to dismantle it because they're evil, including the incredibly callous cease and desisting of a tournament just because they used an emulator to play Smash Melee. Even though, 2 years after this legal action, Nintendo would go on to admit that 1 out of every 7 GameCubes that they released was actually just an empty plastic shell filled with 150,000 spider eggs because they thought that was funny. And of course, this didn't really stop anybody from trying to play Melee competitively, because it's cool, and Nintendo is fucking stupid, and in this case very wrong, and their childish efforts to punch a gift horse in the mouth are entitled and malicious at best. And it's just as bad that the dregs of the TF2 community are trying to do the same thing in Valve's stead. In fact, it might actually be even more embarrassing because at least Nintendo has actual authority on their games, and also because out of all the games in the world to care about developer intention, TF2 might be the worst example you could possibly follow. The entire reason this game exists is because Gabe Newell saw the value in iterating on an existing product rather than making multiple different box releases across generations. And his assumption turned out to be right. Much of this game was made after it released. The original developer intention doesn't really matter, especially when the developers do 180s on things. Engineer used to not be able to move any of his buildings. He had to commit to wherever he wanted to put his nest. That was like a core part of his design. And then later on, the devs realized that's really boring, so they allowed him to move his buildings, which was a massive change for him. And the quality of this update goes, I would hope, without saying. Engineers having to deconstruct and then completely rebuild their nest every time the team moved up or whatever would be really annoying. He already has a lot of problems with keeping up with his team. I don't even like Engineer's character design, but even I cannot imagine playing Engineer for 3 years before this. I'm not gonna sit here and pretend that developer intention isn't at least a little bit important. It can be very valuable to know just how much thought went into any decision, or what the thought process was behind any changes or additions that developers make. And it also adds a lot of perspective. After all, as players, we're not the ones whose lives financially hinge on the game working. But intentions aren't the full process, and just because you intend for something to be one thing doesn't necessarily matter if you do it wrong. And just because something is intentional doesn't mean it's correct or that it's the best way that something could be. The original Tomislav was also an intentional addition to Team Fortress 2, one that had to be emergency patched 3 days after it released because it was insane. I really don't know why anybody gives a shit what Valve wants you to do with this game, especially when they give you all of the tools to do whatever you want with the game. And considering how many mistakes Valve has made in the past, I don't blame any player for finding their own solutions, no matter what level of seriousness they're playing at. To summarize, I don't care what Valve intended to do if they didn't do it. Customized rule sets and competitive leagues are nothing new. It's just out of style for modern games. And finally, these 2 points don't necessarily matter because Valve laid out their intentions very clearly when they were making this game. Somehow this has become lost and forbidden knowledge, but all you have to do is search Robin Walker interview before 2009, all one word, and see very clearly that Team Fortress 2 was not specifically designed to be casual, it was designed to be approachable, and those are 2 very different things. There are plenty of very competitive games that also try to be very approachable so that people compete in them. Even Valve's other 2 competitive games, Dota 2 and Counter-Strike 2, have made recent and deliberate efforts to make it easier for new players to understand. CS2, for example, now simply displays the effect your spray pattern is having on your aim. This was a skill you were just expected to know if you wanted to improve for what, like 10 years? And channel favorite Street Fighter 6 added an entire new control control scheme where you just smash one button and you get a free combo. And this isn't like an analysis I made, they said this. In the words of, again, Robin Walker, I think one of the things we've learned as designers over the time we've been here is to better preserve our ideas while still making them more understandable. We're personally very proud that TF2 is the best product we've produced at doing this, where we don't think we've sacrificed any of the depth or complexity that we wanted, but at the same time players can sit down in front of it and have fun without really understanding half of what's going on. Most things that happen tend to be visually understandable at face value. If I looked back at various designs in the different versions of TF2, then I think that's the thing we moved the most. We were always doing interesting classes, interesting weapons, but I think the thing we succeeded at the most, that we were failing at the most, was that nugget of acceptability relative to depth. You're allowed to believe whatever it is you want, but personally speaking, tournament mode was in this game faster than friendly high-fiving was. I can't hear words like this where somebody specifically mentions the depth of competition and complexity that a game can have and still think that it was a complete accident that Team Fortress 2 ended up being an incredibly deep, fun shooter. What frustrates me more is the fact that, again, this is not a hard thing to find. You just need to know how to search things on fucking Google. It's right in front of you if you actually looked, but for some reason, nobody has decided to bring this to light except for, like, me, I guess, and maybe Solarlight. I haven't seen this video yet. As of this recording, it doesn't exist. And I don't plan on watching it, not because I don't like Solarlight, but because I have to donate my eyes to charity tomorrow. And it's not like this community is incapable of this level of research. And that's another one of the parts that pisses me off so much. Anybody could have done this. And if they had, then the rest of us wouldn't have had to have sat around and argued about whether or not designing weapons with high-level players in mind is a good or a bad thing, since Valve straight up told us they were doing that since at least 2009, and I have older interviews in this video. What's more frustrating, though, is not the fact that random people don't go and make a stink about this, it's the fact that people whose job it is to make a stink about something, and yes, being an influencer is a volunteer position, so you chose this, didn't make a stink about this. Though, in complete fairness, I don't blame just casuals, and I don't blame just YouTubers or TikTokers or whoever. I kinda blame competitive players too. Making people aware of this sort of information is how you build an understanding, and building an understanding with a casual audience is something that even competitive players admit they're not very good at. And of course, I'm not necessarily blaming any one person in particular, it's no one's job to be a YouTuber. But it is disappointing that in the absence of somebody who knows better, this misinformation has been allowed to fester. And to finally close this out, TF2 is allowed to be a casual, funny hat game. Heavies driving silly cars or pyros camping in the water on 2 Fort with the Annihilator are perfectly acceptable parts of this game's ecosystem, and I imagine anybody who isn't the worst human ever would agree with me. I just wish that more people would also agree that competitive players who love this game to the point of carving out their own niche despite being relatively unpopular both in numbers and in opinion from the greater TF2 community, who still play this game even though there's not really any money to be made just for the love of the craft, might also be valuable parts of our game. I don't think comp players like the game any less because they're banning weapons or because they play with fewer people than normal or whatever. I would maybe argue instead that they might love it just a little bit more, because even if their favorite weapon gets canned or their favorite character isn't viable, they love TF2 to its core so deeply they'll play anyway. And they won't just play in an incredibly accessible one-button matchmaker. They'll play in a tertiary community where you have to force time to scrimmage and to play your officials into your busy schedule. And frankly, I don't see how playing Team Fortress 2 with some minor changes, and relatively they are very minor, is any worse or really that different from the people who go around saying that Team Fortress 2 is dead and everything is awful because Valve hasn't updated the game recently. The only real difference is that competitive players like regular Team Fortress 2, but they would like to make some changes that accommodate their playstyle better, and then they did it, and doomsayers sit around saying that they want Valve to update the game just for the sake of it without any clear-cut idea of what would be improved, and instead of using any of the tons of tools you have to make your own server where that happens, they just sit around and complain more. So both of these groups want the game to be different in some way, in a way that they think would improve it, and one of them actually went and did it. Now, this one here is a lot better than our previous claim. This one has two things that one did not. Firstly, it has the mandate of 7 Elven Kings, and also it's based on an honest-to-God, tiny little nugget of truth. But like many things, that nugget of truth is encrusted in a bedrock of lies, so it's our job to excavate it and find the reality of the situation. This argument, as I see it written, is usually some variation of competitive players are responsible for balance changes that happened between 2015 and 2016, and those changes ruined many weapons in Team Fortress 2. Some people more correctly say that it was competitive influence that caused Valve to do this. Other people say that Valve was trying to appease the competitive community because they couldn't just say no to them. But either way, they say that this period of balance changes were horrible for Team Fortress 2 and its competitive players to blame. And again, while all of this is based on a hair of truth, because Valve made a more conscious effort to gather competitive feedback more directly during this period of time, and definitely not before, because it would be really embarrassing if everybody said this was a fact and had the timescale wrong, wink wink. But one way or another, the part of these arguments where they blame the competitive community, and they almost exclusively blame the competitive community, are really dumb. Because even though it is true that Banny has a voodoo doll tethered to Gabe Newell's soul and he occasionally pokes it with a small knife, Valve is a game development company, a very successful one that is staffed exclusively by grown-ass adults. Grown-ass adults who can make their own decisions and cannot in any way be threatened by their community, especially not a tiny portion of it like the comp scene. Competitive players cannot make or force Valve to make these decisions to any degree because Valve are the ultimate authorities on everything that they own, and TF2 is their property. They can shut it down tomorrow and tell all of us to go fuck ourselves if they really wanted to. But even if Valve did listen to these players and execute their ideas with no forethought, that's still not the competitive community's fault. If Valve is adding things or changing things about their game without doing their own due diligence and playtesting just because somebody told them to, they are suffering from problems that extend way deeper than just TF2. They're the game developers. It's their job to be aware of how their game is played, to iterate and test things that they want to adjust, to make sure that it works, to electrolytically graft pro-capitalist hieroglyphs onto the spongy curves of the brains of newborns, and to deploy it in a timely fashion. It's not anyone else's. Blaming the comp scene, even if they had influence, is pointless because they aren't TF2's keepers. But I don't think most people blame the comp players because they actually care. I think they do it because they realize if they try to blame Valve, they're not going to get very far. And even though it's correct, sitting there and being angry at Valve when Valve doesn't have to do anything about you isn't quite as satisfying as going after some more mortal prey that you could maybe actually harm. But either way, it's pointless because I don't think this is what Valve does. I don't think they just invited some people over, listened to them, and then put their stuff directly into the game without any thought. And for the record, I'm not saying that Valve was always making the most well-thought-out decisions, especially in relation to Team Fortress 2. You know, I think this was maybe questionable, and this, and this, and this. TF2 was afflicted by bad decision-making throughout a lot of its life. Nor am I saying that competitive players are perfect analyzers of the game or that they didn't have any influence, because they absolutely, objectively did. The real truth of the matter is that the interviews that happened between 2015 to 2017 aren't really that weird. Because believe it or not, Valve has always kind of been listening, or at least they've always heard us, and I'll explain the difference between those two in a bit. But Valve has multiple times outlined their plans for world domination by seizing the Earth's zinc supply, and they've also explained their methods for community outreach many times in the past. If you do even some rudimentary YouTube archaeology, you can find things like this old GDC talk, where our favorite interviewee, Robin Walker, talks about the process Valve goes through when it comes to incorporating feedback and providing their official stance on matters affecting their games, including specifically TF2.
It became, did their theory crafting thing. They pulled it apart, they decided that that looked interesting, that wasn't interesting, and so on. The community became obsessed with various things. Then we could take the information we were getting about what they cared about and actually build that into the product.
Valve has, to quote him in this talk, a culture of listening, which is really funny, whereby the devs often look over many different outlets that the community uses to get a feeling for what it is we think about trailers, updates, weapons, etc., which Valve uses to help guide their decision making. And not to eat a dead bus driver here, but in another 2011 interview, Robin corroborates this by explaining how many different places Valve gets their feedback from.
That's sort of all that is. So where do you get the majority of the feedback?
I don't know. I mean, we get lots of email, we read lots of forums, and we play a lot of the game ourselves, and we watch a lot of replays and stuff. Before replays, watch stream games, and I mean, I think the responsibility for someone who has a product that like TF is to try and find all the places that your customers are talking about your game and all the places where they're experiencing and creating things around it, and try and you want to take on all that and try and find common threads amongst it. I don't think it's we certainly don't sit down and try and make a decision about which one of these groups we should listen to more, I guess, than others. I think you need to be aware of the biases involved in various forums, right?
In the very comp player interviews that people often cite as the smoking gun for competitive players ruining Team Fortress 2, they mention that Valve showed clear signs of community awareness even then. For one thing, a lot of TF2 team members used to post on the subreddit a lot, even Jill still does that now. And in 2016, multiple interviewers mentioned that Valve used to have a big TV in the Team Fortress 2 offices that would constantly play streams of the game, from what I assume was Twitch or even maybe Justin TV. My point here, of course, is that, yeah, Valve did listen to competitive players from this period of time in a very direct way that they hadn't seen before, but Valve has always been listening and gathering data at any point that they can for anything.
There are interesting trade-offs to be made when you read forums that are dedicated to TF versus gaming forums that happen to be talking about TF. You'll get different data from both of those, and the responsibility of the game developers is to make sure you're reading both of those and reconciling them and being aware of the sort of mental framework that each of those groups is operating in. Neither of them are necessarily more valuable than the other, but you need to be aware of their frameworks, I guess.
Right. Do you feel that any certain forums, such as your own Steam forums, or maybe, say, Face Punch, has influenced Team Fortress one way or the other, or is it just...
I mean, we read them, so they've influenced TF. I mean, it's as simple as that. You can't... the only way a group wouldn't influence TF, really, is if we didn't know they existed. Anyone who sits down to do some work in a given day and thinks about what they should do is going to be thinking about the feedback they've seen from customers. And I don't mean necessarily feedback that was sent to us. I mean just whatever they've read. I mean, often the most valuable feedback is watching customers talk to each other. Someone says, man, this part of the game is broken, and someone else replies, no, it's not, and here's why. And that discussion the two of them can have is useful for us because it helps us see how our customers see the product.
This didn't just magically start in 2015. Competitive players have always had influence on this game. And again, in another one of these interviews that I have stashed in the pouches in my cheeks, Robin Walker talks about how the team would try to appease both competitive and casual players as much as they could without giving too much to any one group, because when they did that, it backfired. Like with the sticky bomb damage nerf, which was horrible. And that's of course not even talking about all the things we talked about in chapter 1 of this video. But for some reason, these days, nobody ever seems to really talk about how much influence this community has had on this game unless it's in the context of things that happened after, like, Meet Your Match. And I think that's because if you had that perspective, if you realized that throughout the entirety of the golden years of Team Fortress 2, competitive players had some amount of influence on the game, well then it probably makes it really difficult to convince everybody around you that the game started going on a downward trend only when the greedy competitive players got their grubby mitts on it. Even though Gunmetal or Meet Your Match or whichever update you want to blame today wasn't the start of any of this. I mean, talking about matchmaking for competitive Team Fortress 2, that dates back to 2010. And as far as those interviews that people like to bring up so much, even in video form, those date back to 2013. There might even be ones I just don't know about that happened before that. I just think it's weird that 2 years before Valve ruined the game by inviting competitive players over, they invited competitive players over. And again, I'm not saying that these interviews weren't significant. There was a huge uptick in how many people were being allowed into Valve to talk about competitive Team Fortress 2. And some of this feedback was taken very directly by Valve. You can almost guarantee that Sigafu is the reason that the Razorback got nerfed in 2016. But even in these interviews, the interviewees themselves talk about the fact that Valve didn't just put stuff in on a whim.
They were very much like, I really appreciated their development style and the way they would ask questions to me when they would try to, like, okay, but so, okay, well, don't tell me, like, tell me why you think that, or what, what about it, and it doesn't have to be right or wrong, but,
Because Valve doesn't just want to listen to any one group, they want to hear the reasoning behind why you want changes to be made. And frankly, I don't want to hear from the community today that they think that they can beat the Cyclops in an arm wrestling match. It's not possible, he has the strength of 10 men. But also, I don't want to hear that it's a bad thing that a game developer who was working on something very directly related to a sub-portion of their game's community is doing the wrong thing because they listen to them. Because again, Valve listening to people is how a lot of the best parts of this game were made. It's not competitive players' fault for taking advantage of an opportunity that was given to them, and it's not Valve's, and I cannot believe I'm saying fault here because this is something every fucking game developer should do, is communicate with their goddamn community, for offering these opportunities in the first place. And frankly, I think if Valve offered all of y'all an opportunity to go and tell them what to do, you would be on a plane in seconds. But even discounting all of the things that have been said either by or about Valve in regards to this, I know for a fact that competitive players were only a part of the consideration Valve was making because there's a lot of inconsistencies between what competitive players thought should be balanced and what was balanced. This right here should be the ESEA 2016 whitelist. I say should be because it's kind of hard to find accurate old whitelists. This right here, I will agree, is ridiculous, and this is what people think whitelists still are today, even though they're not. I'm showing you this so that you can see that it was really not difficult to find a weapon that ESEA thought was problematic. So Valve had plenty of things to choose from if they wanted to nerf or buff a weapon. You nerf the banned ones, and you buff the unbanned ones. That's very simple, right? Well, I bet you would think so if you were a competitive player, but Valve had other things in mind, like nerfing the Claymore. And this was an especially confusing nerf because not only was this weapon not banned and nowhere near overpowered, but also the swords, especially at the time, weren't really a competitively relevant weapon. Demo Knight just wasn't something people played, and even today it's an extremely niche pick by like 2 people. And not only was this weapon nerfed, it was completely redesigned, and nobody knows why. It's not like the weapon was a problem in casual, and we know that because they completely reverted the change in Jungle Inferno. The version of the Claymore we have now is the same one that they had before this nerf. As confusing as this is, it actually makes a lot of sense if you know the reasoning behind it, but you wouldn't know that unless you had an expert explain it to you. So I'm going to throw this video over to my good friend, the Tortured Screaming Peasant, because he's going to do a much better job of explaining it. What do you got for us, TSP? And see, that's a professional. And if competitive players are responsible for all of these balance changes, I'm not exactly sure why they would make this one. Or why they would buff something like, say, the airstrike, which was banned in America at least in 2015, and then got insane weapon-defying buffs in gunmetal. Or again, for example, the Quickie Bomb Launcher, banned in America and from what I can tell Europe, and it wasn't as harshly buffed as something like the airstrike, but it was still buffed. In ESEA in 2015, all miniguns but stock were banned, which, yeah, is nuts. But still, the Tomislav and the Brass Beast both got buffed. The Spicicle is another example of a weapon that was banned in that league and buffed at some point. And this isn't even talking about weapons that were unbanned and then got nerfed, or weapons that were banned and didn't get nerfed. Like for example, the Machina, which was banned and has never received a balance patch in its life, or something like the Righteous Bison, which was famously bug fixed, which happened to completely destroy any reason anybody was really using it to be effective. But not just bug fixed, it also got like straight up nerfed, and this change was so confusing for everybody, even Master Li Fang, and he can see the future.
Weapon, so it's more consistent now. The Righteous Bison is kind of an underrated weapon, honestly, but let's see what else they did to it. Per shot damage increased to compensate, resulting in slightly more damage on average. Really? Point blank does 50 damage instead of 20 to 80. Medium does 24. So it only does 1 hit now? Okay, I actually thought that was how it was supposed to work. Like it was supposed to like pass through them and hit them like 5 times or something. That's interesting.
And there was a bunch of other changes that were just as surprising and just as frustrating for competitive players.
Really care about most of the other changes. They tried to nerf the Criticola by adding Mark to Death for 2 seconds after the buff has expired. What's that meant to achieve? They've also, for some reason, nerfed the Buffalo Steak Sandwich. I'm not sure about you guys, but I'd never noticed any problems with the Buffalo Steak Sandwich. I don't think I was getting wrecked by melee heavies particularly often. And of course, the other thing that's often complained about is the Darwin's Danger Shield, which, according to Valve, is absolutely fine.
And if they were the ones pulling the strings, I don't know how they would get surprised. And I don't want any of you guys who did say this to say that that's not what you said or that's not what you meant, because I screenshotted all of the things you wrote. That's pretty much exactly how you said it. But another thing that this argument just conveniently ignores are the times where competitive players have an analysis of a weapon and a solution that is correct. And that has happened at least in one instance, and it's the only instance where Valve readily admitted that competitive players were the reason for the change, and that was the changes to the Razorback. Sigafu during his visit only talked to Valve about a couple of weapons, namely the Ambassador, the Dead Ringer, and the Razorback. The Razorback is the only one where he had a definitive solution he wanted them to hear, and he explained it, and they put in exactly what he said to the game, and the game is better for it. Before this Razorback nerf, the Razorback used to do exactly what it does now, but you could overheal a sniper who was wearing it, and that is horrible. This meant that a sniper, and remember, this is the class that you all think is the fucking devil and is OP and was ruining the game for the last 6 years and should be removed, which, you know, might partially be my fault, could not only be immune to backstabs for absolutely zero skill investment, but also, if he had a pocket medic or was just near one, he could be immune to tap headshots. Counter-sniping and spies are the two easiest strategies for taking down a problematic sniper. This is especially so in pubs where coordination between players is at an all-time low, and you can't always convince your team to support you if you wanted to try and bomb him as a soldier or something. They're not the only solutions, but they're the first ones worth trying because they work faster than anything else, and you don't need any of your teammates' help to get them to work effectively. And if you think this game is better with snipers, like good snipers who are killing your whole fucking team, who are immune to both of these strategies, you're lying, because everybody and their mother hates this class to the point where the community has tested to see if they can just remove him and overall found that to be a neutral to positive result. And if you're not lying, then you're fucking stupid. Sniper is already a character that has an awkward matchup with a lot of the cast because he's the only character that can really do lethal damage at a long range, and he doesn't need to have an invincible matchup against his own mirror, and a nearly invincible matchup, assuming he has an engineer or anybody looking near him, against Spy. Or what about the times where Valve didn't ask anybody's opinion and got their feedback indirectly by watching competitive matches and made changes that were good for the game? For example, the Wrangler nerf after the Sigafu save. Now Sigafu, if you're watching this, I really hope you don't sue me because I'm about to show off the entire Sigafu save so that you can get an understanding for just how fucked up the Wrangler used to be. If you're a newer player who thinks that the Wrangler is bad now, you have absolutely no idea. Anyway, here's the thing.
Rock and roll, and there's 9 French players alive and they're just ruffling in here, Scully. Look at that, that's a straightaway tech on the sentry gun. All the Ubers being used for the sentry gun. It's still not being taken out. It's still up. Oh, what the hell? Is that still up? I'm sorry. That is insane.
It was a clutch defense helping his team win. You see here, Rescue Ranger whips out the Wrangler for just a second, back to the Rescue Ranger, and then the wrench. Really, no holds barred, excellent engineering. He goes down, but super clutch.
Now look, I'm not the best TF2 player, and I'm not a game designer, but I do think that if a team uses an Uber charge and does nothing with the Uber charge, but have a Heavy, who is the highest DPS character in the game, shoot directly at a sentry gun at point blank range, perhaps the sentry gun should go down even if the engineer has the Wrangler. I just think that Blue Team has used enough incredibly important resources well enough to take down a sentry gun, and I think most people and Valve agreed with me because they nerfed the Wrangler after this to make it so that you couldn't repair it fully while the shield was activated. And I think most people would agree that that was a good change because even today the Wrangler is considered like public enemy #1 on the list of weapons that need to be nerfed. Point is that competitive balancing isn't always the wrong thing, and nerfs especially have an important part in the balancing dance of any game. Sometimes you make something that's just really powerful and really obnoxious, and it's better to introduce weaknesses or tone down the strengths of that weapon than it is to bring everything else up around it, making the rest of the game equally annoying. Like the Launch Tomislav, which had a minus 75% rev time. This basically completely eradicates one of the downsides that Heavy has as a character. It undoes a part of his design, and as you can imagine, it was ridiculously powerful. So powerful that Valve had to nerf it 5 days later, and even that was too strong, so they nerfed it again almost a year to the day after that. And this is way better than just buffing all of the other miniguns into absurdity because this preserves a core part of Heavy's design that makes him fun, but also it gave Valve the opportunity to give the weapon other advantages that resulted in a better But also, pinning everything on one cause just ignores both the reality and the history of this game. Maybe it was Manny's incredible insight that got something like the Sandman nerfed, or maybe it was the fact that the Sandman was problematic for its entire life and had a lot of people who really didn't like it. Maybe it's because Valve clearly weren't very happy with the design and nerfed it multiple times, which signals to me that they were never really capable of finding a good place for the weapon. Or maybe it was because they really just didn't like the design, and Robin Walker even once called it a mistake. I couldn't tell you for sure. Another great example is something like the Caber. Everybody seems to think the Caber was nerfed because comp players complained that it could one-shot medics. Which was true, the Caber did allow you to one-shot half of the cast, but that was only part of the issue. It not only let you do that, it allowed you to cover Demoman's biggest, expressly designed weaknesses. Demoman is supposed to be weaker at the close range. He's supposed to be vulnerable to people pushing him, especially somebody like Scout, which is really hard to hit with a pipe gun. This is why sticky bombs have a delayed timer, because the Demoman either needs to already have a trap up, or he's going to be vulnerable to somebody running into him. The Caber allowed you to just ignore this by pulling out your melee weapon, which not only allowed you to one-shot half the cast, and not only allowed you to do that as a character who wasn't supposed to be good in close range, it allowed you to do that at the cost of getting rid of your weakest weapon slot. That's why all of the swords on Demoman are slower to come out, that way you can't really use them in a pinch close range situation. But not only did the Caber allow you to circumvent one of Demoman's only weaknesses by one-shotting half of the cast at basically no cost because you only got rid of your already weak bottle, but it also allowed you to do all of this without even having to aim. Which is insanity, and I'd like to compare this to Jarani Bushwalker, which is a combo that these days people think is overpowered and should be nerfed and never should have been put on Sniper because Sniper is supposed to be weak at the close range. But here's the differences between the Caber and the Pisswalker. Pisswalker not only requires you to use 2 slots to make the combo work, it also pins you with a perpetual 20% damage vulnerability just for having the Bushwalker equipped, but also you have to pull out the Jarati and throw the Jarati and hit your opponent and then hit them with the Bushwalker, and also you have to aim the Bushwalker and hit them directly. You cannot just swing at the floor and kill them. The Caber eats the Bushwalker combo for breakfast, and then it goes into anaphylactic shock because it forgot it is allergic to the cherry wood that is used in the Bushwalker's handle. Now, is it possible that this weapon got nerfed because competitive players said something? It's possible. It's also possible that Valve knew that something was up with the weapon and decided to make changes now after hearing it from a community member. It's possible they already had these changes planned out and didn't need to hear it from the comp community. In fact, this is something that is conveniently similar between all of the weapons that are often referenced when it comes to Valve ruining the game balance in these patches. Like, yeah, maybe Sigafu is the reason the Ambassador got nerfed, or maybe Valve realized that Sniper should be the only character who can kill people at long range and that it was annoying. Maybe it was comp players who got the Gru nerfed, or maybe Valve realized that Heavy being slow is like one of the fundamental pillars of his character design, and an unlock shouldn't just let you undo those for free. Maybe Banny is the reason that the Deadringer got nerfed, or maybe Valve realized that they designed a character whose entire job it was to go into risky situations and to get dangerous picks and have to skillfully escape the enemy team, and the Deadringer allowed you to have an infinite number of retries at that as long as you knew where an ammo crate was. Maybe they realized that the base jumper was putting multiple other unlocks out of business, and there was a reason that Soldier wasn't allowed to just float in the air for completely free. In fact, I think that's why he has to routinely rocket jump, costing himself health to get in the air. Maybe it was competitive players who ruined all of these weapons. It's possible. It's also possible that there were just simply different people working on TF2 at the time who had a different idea for what direction the game could go in. Maybe Valve just wasn't happy with the places where these weapons were at. Maybe Valve nerfed these weapons so heavily because they had ideas for compensatory buffs that were going to come out later. Maybe, but I'm just saying I don't think it was because a couple of guys came to their office and talked to them. And while we're on the subject, I really don't think a lot of these weapons are ruined. I think they might require the tiniest amount of other loadout sacrifices to use them optimally, or they might require the tiniest bit of brain power to get the most out of them, but I don't think they're ruined. Like the Sandman, I guess, is ruined, but that's because its design was terrible and it shouldn't have existed. And frankly, I think if TF2 didn't have weapons as like an item that you quote-unquote own, because you don't own anything on Steam, it probably would have just gotten removed. But other than that, I don't really think a lot of the weapons that are commonly cited as being in Ruined were in any way destroyed or made completely ineffective. Bonk still does its job at distracting sentries and allowing you to get behind the enemy team as long as you don't just like walk straight past a heavy like you can't fucking see. The BFB is still really good with the right weapons to complement it. I don't understand how people say this one is ruined. The same goes for the Your Eternal Reward. I don't understand how anybody thinks the current version is worse than the old one. The old Your Eternal Reward got massively carried by the Deadringer. The modern incarnation of this weapon is like actually pretty good. The Gru is another one people complain about a lot, but the Gru, again, is really very strong. It's just now you have to use your brain when you use it. Maybe don't just run straight from spawn to the battlefield. Maybe use it in moderation or something. Only one class is really supposed to be able to do and goes against the fundamentals of the video game. The Caber may not be what it once was, but you pair it with a shield, it still does some crazy stuff. The only one that's even remotely as bad as this jarring change of acoustics is the base jumper. And I have to say, yeah, the base jumper is pretty bad. It's not like you could go on a 12 kill streak or something very easily and then sarcastically put footage of yourself doing just that in the video. I don't think that these weapons are bad, I just think that they're no longer universally powerful or brain dead easy to use, or both. Call me crazy, but I think it's okay if the weapon design doesn't trample all over the character design. I think it's okay if we have weapons that don't just remove an entire skill from the game. And I think it's especially okay if we don't have weapons that prevent your opponents from expressing their skills. If I were some sort of internet dickhead, I might suggest that the only reason a lot of people want some of these weapons back is just because they were told to. Some other people, however, might want them back because in their heyday, these weapons were incredibly simple to use and very powerful, so it was really easy to crutch on them. And after their nerfs, these types decided that instead of expanding their skill set and adapting, they instead decided to just blame the game and say that everything is awful now that they can't effortlessly pwn noobs. In fact, I think that's the leading cause of why people have such an anti-comp bias these days. But if you know anything about Valve, you'll know that this kind of balancing is pretty par for the course. Their balancing process, by their own admission, was flawed.
They wanted a similar style to CSGO in a sense, where like you could basically the idea is it'd be really simple to get into a matchmaking format and just go for it. One part of this is that they really want to use it to get data to be able to rebalance items really well. That was a huge part. Rather, they are aware that a lot of items have balance issues, so they want to get data on like how items could be better balanced and stuff like that.
To add on to that, right now they admitted themselves they really don't have a way to gauge balance. If they make a small change to the weapon, say the Scottish resistance or something, tweak a small part of it, they can't really get any actual feedback from it unless they tweak it to an extreme, and people see, oh, this is really overpowered, and they all start using it, and they start complaining. But for small changes, they really have no idea if they're going in the right direction.
And even though I think these weapons are fine, I do think there are some small quality of life changes that could be made to make them less annoying, but also not too strong. But even if I did get some kind of an audience with Valve, and I talked to them about the changes I wanted to make, I don't have any guarantee that they would really sit down and listen to me. But as we all already know, that's nothing new for Valve. And honestly, I think that's one of the bigger flaws with Valve's treatment of Team Fortress 2. So if the modern weapons aren't horrible, why does it seem like the old balancing was so much better? My answer to that is like, was it? Like, did y'all see the Liberty Launcher when it released? That weapon was like the rocket launcher, but even easier to use in a pub setting. It was like the purest definition of a crutch. That's not even talking about things like the Babyface's blaster, where it was impossible to get rid of a scout's boost, the old Pretty Boys, which gave the scout a health boost, which you just could not know unless they pulled it out, the old Lock and Load, which was not only easier to hit with because it has a faster projectile, but also had 20% extra damage, so sometimes it would just kill light classes. The Vaccinator, the Razorback, and the Wrangler all used to be even stronger than they are now. And again, things like the old Sandman, which were just like an anti-skill weapon, or the old Gru, which just allowed Heavy to be fast because he owned a thing, or something like the old Deadringer, which before its cavalcade of nerfs was a monster. Again, Spy's character design is to use the Inviswatch to get behind the enemy, and then risk themselves to go in and get big stabs. But why would you bother doing any of that when you could just flash your Deadringer, die, go get an ammo pack, and do it again as many times as you ever wanted? Everybody loathes the Diamondback now, but the Ambassador used to basically just be that all of the time. Or something like the old Tide Turner, which was insane. And that's only the overpowered ones. There were a lot of weapons that were just dead on arrival or completely overshadowed by the competition for years. Like the Airstrike, which on release was a complete joke. Personally, I don't think balancing was better. I think that players were generally much worse, especially shortly after the free-to-play update, and these weapons were simply much more easy to exploit. So all you had to be to win was a competent player, and the more you win, the more likely you are to like a game, even if it's for bad reasons. Earlier in the video, I mentioned that Valve claimed to have something called a culture of listening.
And it's also important that this team has essentially a culture of listening, right? They should regard the process of gathering feedback about their work as valuable work and something that they need to do.
Which is pretty funny, because it's Valve. There's a lot of people, especially TF2 fans I think, that are willing to write that off as a complete lie, and even though I understand your frustrations, there's definite proof that, at least to some degree, Valve does some kind of feedback and data gathering. That being said, I wouldn't exactly call it a culture of listening. I think instead you get more of a culture of hearing, which is very different. Listening to somebody is like hearing them say, "I don't like your dog because he's smelly," so you solve the problem by giving your dog a bath. You try to internalize the full depth of their concerns. Hearing somebody is hearing that same concern, that somebody doesn't like your dog because he's smelly, and solving it by sacrificing him to Heket. You got the consensus of the problem, but you didn't get the specifics. This was relatively common for Valve when it came to Team Fortress 2, and nothing again shows this more clearly than Meet Your Match itself. Valve heard or assumed people wanted a ranked mode. Now, regardless of your opinion on Meet Your Match, which was a lot of things, there's one thing that it wasn't, and that's anybody but Valve's fault. For one thing, Valve admitted that Meet Your Match was not in an acceptable state when it was released. So, you know, I don't know who else's fault it even could be when they're the ones taking the blame, but whatever. And if we also ignore things like, again, the fact that Valve are the game developers and they own the game and all that stuff, I don't think Meet Your Match, and especially not ranked mode, are at all what anybody in the competitive community wanted. Now, if you watched the first 2 chapters of this video, you'll know that I'm not the one who released the Curse of the Twisting Eyes, but also, this is something that Valve and especially competitive players had an interest in for a very long time. By 2016, Valve had already made 2 competitive games that were smash hits, and comp players wanted their own matchmaking system. Because having to find games through external leagues, which have scheduling issues and are generally hard to penetrate for prospective new players, is kind of ass. And even outside of the obvious surface-level conveniences, what Valve promised sounded really good. The earliest mentions I found of this topic were in 2010, but things really heated up in 2011. That year, Robin Walker talked to members of EXTV, who used to be a big news source / YouTube channel for competitive Team Fortress 2. The interview was really big for the topic. It shed a lot of light on the things that Valve was still hung up on and what they wanted and envisioned for a future potential competitive matchmaker. And their original ideas were really good, and that's probably the most painful part of this entire thing. Except for maybe that guy they put into the Vein Twister. That was probably more painful. What Robin Walker said he envisioned was a Highlander-esque format with some kind of a pick-ban system. Really, he just wanted anything that would provide more class variety. And while some people have criticisms of Highlander, and I personally don't think it would have worked for a matchmaker just because 18 people is a lot of people to find, especially as you climb the ranks, the fact that what Robin suggested resembled any kind of a competitive format was great. And even if you're the sweatiest, smelliest comp hater on the planet, you can't deny that this would have been exciting for the game. For one thing, matchmaking allows people to find each other easier, instead of having to join a third-party league and having to schedule your matches, which traditionally is very difficult and is also hard to penetrate for prospective new players. There would obviously also be ranks to help quantify the skills of the player base so that you don't get any crazy rolls, and this would also provide Valve with desperately needed data. The pick ban system is what I think was especially cool. Instead of having a whitelist that's formed by some committee, or even worse, some guy just because they're the one who owns the league, players would be able to craft their own ban list that is agreed upon fairly and organically. There wouldn't be any questions from new players or spectators as to why certain weapons are banned, because the explanation would be very simple. The players in that match agreed to have it banned. And I think a lot of the anti-ban list sentiment would have gone away if they weren't formed seemingly so arbitrarily from the outside. The limited number of banned slots also means that there's a lot of opportunities for random weapons to just accidentally get let loose, first, and then you can see what they do and see what needs to be changed about them. And that's not even to mention the strategy crafting that goes on when you ban certain weapons, especially if you know the kind of playstyle that your opponent uses. These kinds of pick ban systems are used a lot by MOBA players, especially to prevent the Maken Super Troll from feasting on more night joggers. Pick bans also give Valve even more granulated data on what kinds of weapons are banned the most or allowed the most and in what ranks. And of course, regular casuals would benefit too, because all of the sweaty pub stomper tryhards like me would go and play the ranked mode instead of rolling the bones on casual. If you look at videos from competitive players from before Meet Your Match released, you'll realize just how exciting this idea was. A lot of them likened it to a quick play for ranked.
You know, they want to put in like a quick play like thing.
And since I said quick play, my metrics are going to go through the roof. Thanks for the upvotes, everybody. But jokes aside, a quick play for ranked is kind of exactly what people wanted. And then Meet Your Match released, and the ranked mode, well, it certainly wasn't quick. In fact, the ranked mode wasn't really anything anybody wanted whatsoever. It was 6v6, which at least was a tried-true competitive team size, but it was 6v6 with no restrictions, which is an unpopular format now, let alone then. There were also a great deal of other confusing properties about it. The map pool especially had a lot of weird inclusions like Turbine, like not even just a CTF map, even though CTF hasn't been played competitively at that point for like 8 years, but of all the CTF maps, Turbine? And on top of that, there were all-star competitive maps that everybody liked, like Bagel, that were missing. There were also very strange restrictions on what kind of configuration you could have your game in graphically, which is a really confusing property for the competitive mode to have, given that competitive players are renowned for having really strange low-quality configs that were basically banned and unusable in this mode. And on top of all of this, the fucking thing didn't even work.
Holy shit, we got a game! I got a game! That was literally a 17-minute queue time. 17 minutes. This better be like the most balanced game of all time, because clearly the matchmaker didn't want to settle for any kind of B-grade matchups right there. It only wanted to go for the best. 14 minutes. What the hell? Did the timer just skip to 0? Did he just... Are we waiting for players again? Really?
In the very early days, even outside of the fact that matches took a very long time to form and often wouldn't fire because somebody would disconnect or somebody just wouldn't connect, even funnier is that sometimes you would connect for man versus machine and get sent to competitive. The fucking thing was a mess from the jump, which is really frustrating because on the outside it seems like Valve almost did everything right. They had an open public beta testing group and would host multiple play sessions to try and implement this feedback. It's really not hard to sympathize with the people who thought that this was going to be different back in the day. Valve was no stranger to releasing updates that were broken at first and had to be fixed like a week or a month or years later, but this time there was an open channel of communication, at least somewhat, and they were doing routine playtests, so there were a lot of opportunities to provide feedback and then to have that feedback actualized. But as the beta dragged on, it became increasingly clear that things were amiss. Playtesting sessions had longer and longer breaks in between them, and certain problems that were reported during the beta just never got fixed. If you look at the Steam forums for the competitive beta group, you can still see some of the last posts made were from people who were wondering why certain things weren't being fixed. And of course, we all know that it released in this frustrating state. Instead of giving competitive players what they wanted, they gave them a mode with an oddly restrictive rule set, a bizarre map pool, and a format that wasn't really better than what they already had. This isn't to mention all of the features that Valve talked about or that competitive players suggested that just never manifested. The pick ban system obviously is nowhere to be seen, despite how cool that would have been, and a watch tab, which is something a lot of competitive players wanted Team Fortress 2 to have, a thing on the main menu where you could watch streams or competitive matches like you can in Dota, which obviously never happened. And that's not even talking about the one thing that I think competitive players wanted more than any of this, which was some kind of a guarantee that Valve was going to tangibly support the TF2 competitive scene. Some kind of promise that they were going to back tournaments and events and make it worthwhile for players to keep playing Team Fortress 2 instead of switching over to the giant golden check writing machine that Blizzard had on the horizon. Meet Your Match as a whole was disappointingly unfinished, but competitive mode in particular was nothing near what anybody in the competitive community wanted. That's evident alone just by the fact that nobody plays it. But it wasn't just that competitive mode was bad, It was the comp scene's worst nightmare. This was something they had to on and off ask Valve for more than 7 years. And as we all know, getting Valve to do anything is seemingly impossible. So getting something from Valve and them fucking it up is the worst outcome. Valve heard the community and gave them quote-unquote what they wanted and wasn't about to do it again. This already took, who knows, 8-9 years to manifest. There wasn't going to be a second chance. Valve isn't really a company known for going back on something that they perceive to have failed at. And of course, that's not even talking about just the general apathy that Valve has towards projects that they're not personally interested in. How many third installments has the entire world been hounding Valve to make for the better part of 20 years? They're so prolific for not listening to the basic desires of their community that there's been like decades of memes and internet culture about it. Everybody knew that this was going to be Team Fortress 2's first and final chance for an official competitive mode. People like to complain about what casual players lost in Meteor Match, like a lot. And I'll reaffirm that a lot of those complaints are pretty valid, at least until you guys start going crazy and complaining about like the removal of Fledglore, the sapient ball of skin and pus, because that thing had to go. But from what I can tell, a lot of people don't really seem to talk about what competitive players lost. They lost their only chance to really be something in the eyes of Valve. This was supposed to be a doorway into Valve supporting a competitive community for this game, which is a really awesome competitive game. It was supposed to allow for more clear communication, even if it wasn't necessarily verbal, between the developers and the player base. It was supposed to be a chance for tournaments for Team Fortress 2 to have the glory that they deserve. Casuals might have lost like the team swap button and vote scramble, and that does suck for sure. Competitive players lost not the chance to surpass CS or Dota, because that was never gonna happen, but the only chance they were ever going to get of being treated as if they were as valid as those games. And again, Valve lost out as well. These data gathering tools are really important. A lot of the current Valve design philosophy is iterating on feedback. Without this kind of feedback, the dev team for Team Fortress 2 was only going to become more and more out of touch with the game itself, as more and more people stop working on it and probably as a result play it less and less. This makes it increasingly difficult for the few remaining developers to make concrete decisions on things. I think one of the biggest reasons we don't get balance patches anymore is not because there's too few people working on TF2 or anything, because a balance patch is probably something one guy could do, but more so because working on Team Fortress 2 is probably already not the coolest thing to be doing at Valve, and I doubt anybody wants to go into work as the one guy who works on Team Fortress 2 and recently released a patch that fucked everything up. This reluctance has already been documented for things much less important than a balance patch, so I doubt Eric or whomever are any less reluctant to do things that are actually important. And of course, all of this was bundled next to changing regular matchmaking in ways that are not fantastic. Like, I'm not a huge quick play promoter. I think the people who promote this are really fucking annoying, especially the people who didn't play during quick play like I did. But I do admit, I think that a best of 5 format would be worth trying out. Best of 5 is not only better competitively because you get a bigger sample size to see who the real winner is, but also it would make the matches last longer and might make it so that people would leave games less quickly just because they get into a little bit of trouble. It might also give casuals more time to do, you know, whatever the fuck they like to do. And also, I would love to have, like, you know, vote scramble and team swapping back, or at least being able to, like, volunteer to be auto-scrambled before anybody else. All of this nonsense has dragged the competitive community's name through the mud for things that they didn't really do. Hell, a lot of this is stuff they didn't even ask for. People point to these interviews like their mere existence is evidence of some kind of a crime, but I don't think that many people have really sat down and listened to or read through them. And I say that because a lot of people blame their perceived woes with Team Fortress 2 on competitive players or just comp as an idea, but if you listened to these interviews, you would hear that competitive players don't really care about casuals. Surprise, surprise. Or rather, they didn't care during the development of the update. After it released, and for some of them before it, many of them were just as frustrated as anybody else.
Guys, for the past 3 or 4 years now, Valve has consistently let TF2 players down with almost every single update. And I'm done giving Valve the benefit of the doubt, and I'm done pretending that the way they're treating TF2 is okay.
So the thing that really annoys me is that Valve are obviously wanting to put competitive into the game, and regardless of what anybody says, it's clear that they're only doing it because Overwatch has come out and it's taken some of their player base, right? So they're like, oh shit, they had no idea what ESEA was, which is like the only tournament that is hosted or that exists for American TF2 pretty much, which is fucking shocking. It really And another problem as well is that obviously the TF2 community and the competitive TF2 community have been begging, have been fucking, you know, crying for some sort of, you know, community interaction with Valve.
We can, god damn it! Can't wait to play that video game, can't wait to search for more video games. There we go, those are some pretty good settings, I think I'm ready to... I've seen this notification more than I have my kid that my bitch ex-wife took for... Taking a casual game like TF2 and translating it into the competitive scene is no doubt an arduous task, but I hold full belief that if anybody can do it, Valve can. A lot of issues plague the current competitive beta, but I'm sure the kinks will be worked out by the official release.
The only ones who weren't were the people with a more even temper, who were willing to see if things got better shortly after release. For the more explosive types though, they told Valve in short order what they thought of their update. This included even collaborative efforts from high-profile competitive names. Yet it turns out people who played Team Fortress 2 Ranked are not mustache-twirling supervillains. They're just people who play Team Fortress 2 at the highest level that they can because they think it's cool and fulfilling and frustrating and exciting and awesome. Except for JPEG, who moonlights as a Death Knight, but that's not the point. The point is that there is no reality where this is the fault of competitive players unless you are trying to sell people something, and I don't mean literally sell them, I mean sell them on like an idea, or you are a child. Valve's efforts to incorporate competitive were so useless to... not even useless, actively detrimental to the goals of competitive players that I just can't believe that this is their doing. I simply can't. Like, do you seriously believe these random dudes were able to strong-arm a bunch of well-off grown men into changing their favorite game in such a fashion that it harmed the way that they like to play it? Is that really what we're going with? Because if that's what we're going with, I'm down. I just think that maybe we're overlooking a couple of possibilities, like maybe that Valve just made a mistake and then didn't fix it because they don't care, or how to deal with other problems, like the enormous gilded pelican that keeps trying to put India into its weird lower beak membrane thing. Competitive players are guilty of the crime of what exactly? Providing their opinions when they were asked? Are they blasphemers because when these updates were new, they were trying to maintain some amount of excitement that Valve would eventually fix them or that things wouldn't end up as bad as they did? Did they ruin the game by being frustrated when Valve failed to deliver, by telling them that, and for some of them, leaving the game outright, something that no YouTubers today have the stones to do, but somehow this is all still their fault, even though I'm not convinced that any of this was really done because competitive players wanted it at all. That might sound like it contradicts a lot of the things I already said. And to set the record straight, I do think Valve was listening to people, I do think they knew that there was a desire for this kind of a mode, and I know for a fact that they did act on some of this feedback. But I don't think that feedback alone, especially from a niche part of the community, is enough to get them to undertake something as crazy as overhauling the matchmaker for one of their games. I think the reason we got what we got was not because people wanted it, because the game went on for, what, 9 years without it, and they didn't seem to feel any pressure then, even though the sort of golden age of the competitive TF2 community had already passed, and with it the most amount of influence they possibly could have had, but instead I think it was something that was a little bit more secretive. I think it might have been the 2 gigantic video games that Valve made that were producing billions of dollars a year. I don't know, something about the way that Valve are profiteers makes me believe that they care more about potentially millions of dollars in profit than they do about a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent of their customer base. But if it's not competitive players' fault that this happened, whose fault is it? It's easy to say just Valve, but Valve isn't necessarily an incompetent developer. They make really good stuff. So where was the slip-up? And I think the answer is unsurprising and therefore unsatisfying. TF2's history is nothing if not the story of a game playing third wheel to 2 other more successful younger siblings. Valve is pretty well known for being a company that doesn't really make games unless the game is promoting some kind of a technology or some kind of game design philosophy thing that they think is cool. They're also a company that famously allows employees to work on basically whatever they want within reason.
So the scarce commodity here is not money, it's how many hours there are in a day. So everybody's expected to essentially vote on what is most important to our customers by the projects that they work on.
Every project at Valve is always in competition with how interesting and how cool or how exciting every other project is. And that's not even to mention the financial responsibility they have to support things like Steam and CS. And I imagine that in 2015 to 2016, it was probably really difficult to convince yourself to go work on Team Fortress 2 compared to all of the other things around you. Between 2015 and 2018, the the SteamOS and the Steam controller would release and then be quietly discontinued. I don't know for sure, but considering the Steam Deck runs on SteamOS and uses a lot of the features of the Steam controller, I wouldn't be surprised if its development started in 2018-2019-ish. Fundamental planning for the project probably started even earlier than that. This is also during the period where Dota 2 became the first Valve game to be ported over to Source 2. And of course, after that, every other game of theirs slowly got left behind as the company changed towards using the new engine. This includes their training, and again, I don't know for sure, but I would bet that anybody brought on after like 2018, and especially so after CS2 released, was trained more on Source 2 than they were on Source 1. Half-Life Alyx also began development initially in 2016, and this was a project so monumental that Valve had to make the biggest team they've ever formed to complete it. But not only that, they also had to partially change how the company functioned to finish the game, and this took at least some amount of talent away from Team Fortress 2. Again, I don't know exactly how much, but Robin Walker, who I'm pretty sure wasn't really working on TF2 anymore at this point, Eric Smith, David Riller, and Jill are all in the credits for that game. This isn't even mentioning like Valve's place in the burgeoning VR market, or other projects like Dota Underlords and Deadlock, wherever they fit into this mess. Valve has openly stated multiple times that man-hours are the key resource that they operate on.
And that lets you make this trade that at Valve we're really excited about. That lets us basically trade data and compute for engineering time. Because at Valve, we are always short on engineers, but we have a lot of data and we have a lot of compute power.
And TF2 was already struggling to vie for developer attention after Dota 2 and CSGO outpaced it. Having to fight against those two games and Steam and all of these burgeoning new opportunities is not a good matchup for this old game. Now of course, again, I don't work at Valve, so I can only make assumptions. But if I had to guess, I would assume that the team got really excited at the idea of making $100 million, or just got excited at the idea of taking a new big step for Team Fortress 2, and then they got cracking on it, and eventually the novelty wore off, and then all that was left was the boring, trudging work of making this function correctly. And while they were sitting there, probably bored out of their mind and frustrated that they were trying to work on a game that's like 1,000,000 miles of code long, more enticing and, for Valve's purposes, more important projects got started. And just going by Meet Your Match's proximity to a bunch of stuff that could kill it, and the fact that the open beta testing was 4 months long and not very much changed during it, I'm putting my chips on the possibility that the team just kind of pushed Meet Your Match and maybe even like Gunmetal and Jungle Inferno out there. Maybe in the hopes that in the downtime that they have from working on other stuff that they could come back and fix things progressively. That would explain why things seemed so rushed and unfinished in Meet Your Match. And it would explain why the game has been getting a dwindling amount of the kind of support people want since 2016. But I don't know for sure, and I might be wrong. Maybe I got it right, or maybe the contributions made by our TF2 veterans to these other projects were smaller or token. Maybe they've been doing dual enrollment, working on multiple different games or things at one time, including TF2. Maybe the Team Fortress team didn't, for lack of a better term, disintegrate until much later, like 2019 or 2020. Or maybe they only stopped by to work on Half-Life Alyx or the Steam Deck or something and have returned to Team Fortress 2 to work on it very diligently, simply deciding that the game doesn't really need the kind of updates that people have been begging for. It's not like there's no evidence to suggest that too.
Take a game like Dota, for example. There are thousands more elements. Sorry, Slacks. Than TF2, but TF2 has its identity. It's, you know, at some point you risk adding so much noise that, you know, it's not an easy answer, right? That if you ask me, can I go in there right now and add weapons and would they be okay? Probably, yeah. But talk too far into the future. But you know, there will always be room for more things in TF, and the question is, what form should they take? Of course.
I wouldn't be surprised if it was some gigantic amalgamation of all of this, but I do know that it's very, very unlikely that all of this was caused because a bunch of effectively powerless fans went to go talk to some developers. But TF2 players have such a strange axe to grind with competitive players, or just like the general notion of esports or trying to play a game as well as you can, that they'll say things like the very idea of having some kind of competitive influence was always doomed to fail, which is a load of cop-out horseshit, because if Melee can not only survive but thrive as a competitive game despite the fact that the game has no developer support, and where half of the mechanics and techniques are things that are the unintended consequence of Nintendo trying to get the game out before launch, then I don't see why Team Fortress 2 couldn't have done the same thing if they had made a competitive update that was good. But finally, to close this out, and this is kind of just a personal thing, so skip it if you'd like, but the notion that Team Fortress 2 is ruined is something I find to be really wrong. I don't know, I just can't get behind it. Like, yeah, Team Fortress 2 isn't perfect, and there are things that could be better. Here, to prove that I'm not some Valve shill or whatever, because positivity is a crime in this community, I think warpaints are stupid. I think that if you were going to have weapon skins at all, which personally I could do without, you should have just let people retexture over the existing UV unwraps, which makes a much better skin, which examples within this game showcase, but no, we had to go with this modular nonsense. I think the matchmaker could be improved. I don't know why it tries to put you in a game that's about to end. That's stupid. I think the ranked mode was a missed opportunity. I don't know if you could tell. And even though I think the gameplay is stellar, I do think one last quality of life balance patch could just iron out some of the little bumps that there are. And yeah, I do think that occasionally an ugly hat gets into the game, but as somebody who has played a number of games that have just like melted in my hands, I just can't say that this game is ruined. And of course, let me pamper the fragile mental state of people who really don't want to hear positive things about Team Fortress 2 by saying that yes, you are allowed to criticize it and your opinion is valid and all this other horseshit. But for me personally, the game is fantastic. And it's functional, and it's not just functional, like I can open a dedicated server for Team Fortress 2 in one button if I wanted to. Right now, I can submit real code changes to the developers over email and have like the tiniest chance of it actually working. These are luxuries that are not afforded to other games. Street Fighter X Tekken is a game I mentioned in Chapter 2, and that's a game I really like. It's something I wish I had gotten to play when it was new. Because despite the fact that there's a niche but dedicated community of people who play it on a Discord, I can't even fucking buy the thing legally. It's completely removed from all purchasing platforms. The only way you can play this fucking game is by running it through an emulator, of course after dumping your own BIOSes legally, and using the emulator's netplay to go and play people on like faux PS3 netcode, which is horrible. I think the criticism that the Team Fortress 2 community is entitled is not entirely unfounded, but I also don't think people make that criticism because Team Fortress 2 is doing so well and there's nothing to complain about and oh, the toxic positivity. I think they make that criticism because people from other games have this thing called perspective, and they see the Team Fortress 2 community get something that is either not really that big of a deal, or something that is objectively positive, and then complain about it, acting like Valve just blew up your fucking house. Like, only in the modern TF2 community is being given the source code, the development kit for your game, so that you can do whatever the fuck you want with it, a bad thing. So what is my point with all of this? After all, I've been yapping for so long that we've already tried and failed to perform a coup d'etat on Valve itself. If TF2 is doing oh so okay as I claim, and I do think it's doing okay, not great, not terrible, just okay, then why are people still so consistently upset? What is the prevailing issue behind Team Fortress 2? And that's something I think we all know, but honestly, if I didn't pay attention to Team Fortress 2 discourse, I probably wouldn't know, because when I play this game, I load it up, I go into a server that I like, I play the kind of Team Fortress 2 that I think is the most fun, and then I log off. And I think that if more people did that, a lot of this game's problems would just magically disappear. People wouldn't have to play the shitty mode that they apparently don't like if they just went to the other option that's right beneath it. But then again, if you did that, you can't spend every waking moment since the free-to-play update saying TF2 is dying. This often overbearing but always omnipresent negativity is caused by one thing: the fact that TF2 doesn't get the kind of updates that people want anymore. It still gets updates, which some people say that it doesn't. It still gets supported, it just doesn't get any major gameplay or balance patches. And of course that sucks, because what makes Team Fortress 2 truly good is an endless deluge of mediocre, if not shit, weapons. Why would we enjoy the incredibly deep mechanics that we have now and have always had when we could get a new toy every 3 months? Me being a huge piece of shit aside, I think we can all understand why these updates are so popular. When they're done well, they're really cool. In my opinion, a lot of weapons added to this game are like kinda mid, but there is a small upper crust of fantastic weapons that have an outstanding positive effect on both the game and the characters that wield them. More of those type of weapons, more like shields and market gardeners, would be great, and the frustrations towards this are pretty justified. After all, even for a game that's deeply within maintenance mode, I think that a yearly small balance patch is very well within the realm of Valve's capabilities. Kind of technically speaking, I've sort of made a balance patch myself, and I'm like worth 0.1% of a real programmer, so if I can do it, you can do it too, Valve. But why exactly all of this negativity got dumped onto the competitive / tryhard audience? I think there's only two real possibilities. Possibility 1. This was all a diversionary tactic orchestrated by the Clinton administration to distract you from the fact that Chelsea Clinton was just married to the Martian Duke of Tharsis Rise. Or the second, much less likely option. People will believe things if you say them with authority, but that's ridiculous, because Team Fortress 2's community has a large population of impressionable and easily directed teenagers. But even if that were the case, how could you hate tryhards? They're so likable. Unless you're losing to them. After all, a tryhard is just somebody who wants to be good at something, and that something in this case is Team Fortress 2. And generally speaking, tryhards are really good for your game to have. Sure, some tryhards are assholes, but some amount of any group of people are assholes. Tryhards are good mostly because they're honest. The goal for a competitively aligned player is to win, and in doing so they will search out, almost to a fault, any advantages or disadvantages that they or their opponents could use to claim victory. They're quite good at figuring out what is most effective in a game, and as such where any problems may lie, and they're especially good at finding things that aren't very skillful and not fun to play against. After all, tryhards don't want to lose, and they certainly don't want to lose to something that feels like it's dismissive of all of the efforts they've put in to get good at whatever game it is. Basically, tryhards are really good at figuring out what isn't fun to play against. I think this is why competitive players often get characterized as the party poopers. And some of them certainly can be, but I don't think it's that simple. It depends highly on the person, the game in question, and whatever part of that game you're talking about. There are some players out there who get either a large portion of or the entirety of their livelihood from esports who have advocated for games getting crazier. Either way, having this perspective as a game developer is really important. I don't think I'm being a dick by saying a lot of casuals don't necessarily care about your gameplay. They might be there for other things. And also, even if they are, they often leave a lot on the table. Competitive players don't get a perfect understanding of any game, of course, but they do become subject matter experts. Like just saying, but who do you trust to give better advice on, say, Demoman? Somebody who has like a 0.3 KD ratio and barely knows how the class works, or the guy who can consistently hit multiple pipes in a row and knows all the spots for sticky traps and knows the rollouts. Like, I'm not saying the better player knows everything, but I am saying they probably know, like, more? But tryhards aren't just one-trick ponies, and they're not only good for things that are too powerful, they're also the best possible kind of player for things that are seemingly underpowered. Because tryhards want every possible advantage they can over their opponent, they often want to explore exactly how powerful any weapon or strategy or character can be. I've talked about it a lot, but Melee is again a great example of this. Melee is a game that has had multiple different characters have the glass ceiling of their supposed tournament viability completely shattered by a few dedicated players who pushed the limits of what they could do. Donkey Kong and Yoshi were two characters that supposedly for 20 years were never going to win a tournament, and then they won a tournament. And of course the same goes for Team Fortress 2. The best example we have in our game is probably either Spy or Trollger, and while Spy's modern success is absolutely molded by the efforts of his player base, I'm going to go with Trollger for my example because Spy, being like a real character, has gotten heaps more developer support than Trollger ever has. And Trollger, being a character that is completely defined by the skill level of the user, would be an absolute joke if it wasn't for players like Kritsme or Herb or Rarinstein, who's the first person I can find that used the term Trollger, shredding the envelope on what he's capable of. In the hands of the right player, a Trollger can be a serious threat to an unprepared enemy. A lot of people like to claim that as skill levels get higher, the possibilities within a game dwindle. And this is partially true. Good players are going to punish you for more things than a bad player will. But at the same time, at these higher levels of play, there's more of a chance that everything in the game is being used as powerfully as it can be. If there were ever a set of hands where a weapon could shine, it would be in the hands of a strong player. Some people even dedicate their entire gaming career to doing this. They're called low-tier heroes, and personally they're some of my favorite players to watch. These are players entirely dedicated to proving that the supposedly bad weapons or characters or whatever in a game are not as bad as everybody says they are. And this kind of activity is why I personally really like Tryhards. They're willing to put in the work to improve. They're willing to face off against opponents knowing very well that they could lose. Some of them are even willing to get up on a literal stage in front of hundreds of people in person and thousands of people at home, putting their pride and their ego on the line to fight through grueling tournament brackets just for the chance to win the entire thing and prove that they are in fact that motherfucker. In many games they do this even for no real money. How anybody could hate this group of people, I have no idea. Actually, that's a lie. I do have one idea. I think that Tryhards, because they improve their skills, make it so that people around them lose more games. And because TF2 is full of definite casual players who don't really care about winning or losing that much, they get incredibly upset whenever they lose to somebody who's higher skilled than them. And since competitive players don't have very much of a footprint, at least until very recently in this community, it makes them an easy target. They're outnumbered inherently because being a tryhard requires any amount of effort, but being a casual is what everybody who plays Team Fortress 2 is. Hell, you don't even have to play Team Fortress 2 by default. And they're also outgunned because while competitive players are busy playing competitively, the casuals that they've insulted are busy writing rants and making YouTube videos about how horrible they are, even though their direct influence on the game is like zero. And when you sift through all the lies, all they ultimately did was talk to some dudes. They gave their feedback, and if giving your feedback is a crime in this community, we're all guilty. So if it wasn't competitive players, then that means we have to be mad at Valve, right? Well, kind of. That would be preferable, because at least when you're mad at Valve and you demand change from them, you might actually get something. Like, I don't know if any of the temper tantrum throwers had stopped to notice for a second, but yelling at Banny doesn't fucking do anything because Banny can't patch the game. But also, I don't think the amount of outrage that the TF2 community is capable of outpouring actually does anything. But then again, that's the point, isn't it? Making rants and being angry has all of the production and passion and appearance of seeming like you're doing something without having to do any of the actual work. If anger alone could have fixed Team Fortress 2, then we wouldn't be having any of these discussions because the game would have been fixed like 7 years ago. Like, again, you're allowed to express your opinion, you're allowed to be angry, you're allowed to be dissatisfied with how Team Fortress 2 is at the moment. You're allowed to do all of these things, and there's plenty of valid things to be upset about. But to me, it's become nothing but frustrating watching a community that has so many tools and so much ownership over their game, leagues more than many other games get, do almost nothing with that in favor of sitting around and crying. The one time that bitching and moaning worked, when it was done in coalescence, was fix/say whatever Team Fortress 2. But instead of taking a step back and wondering if maybe finding some kind of a common ground between the community and having a clear voice be heard by Valve is how you get things done and give them, good feedback that they can act upon, they decided to instead go back to arguing about inactionable stupid shit. Which, by the way, I think it's really funny how quickly everybody flipped the script on making noise without any real pressure, which Fix TF2 was criticized for, because last I checked, all those interviews were just noise, and also making a bunch of noise with no tangible pressure is literally all you fucking people have done for 6 years. But of course, why would you go and actually do something when actually doing something is difficult, thankless work and posting on Reddit is free? I would put good money that off the top of your head, most of you could name 3 or 5 videos talking about some kind of issue with Team Fortress 2. You know the name, you know who posted it, you probably know when it was posted almost to the dot, and you know what it's about. Now name one of the community bug fixers who submits changes to Valve. I bet the only one most people know is Mastercoms, and that's quite disappointing because bug fixers are the people actually making the game better. With YouTubers, it's rather arguable if they have any tangible effect at all, myself included. Now of course, this is understandable. YouTube is much more entertaining than programming, but it's not just programmers who get sadly ignored. Community server hosters and in fact community servers in general are ghosted constantly by this community. And I have to say it's really funny that a group of people who complain so much about the matchmaker don't just go use the other thing right underneath it that allows you to completely circumvent the matchmaker. And that's not even bringing up people like workshoppers who are treated like they're making the game worse rather than just being ignored. And again, the disappointing part is that this just doesn't have to be this way. There are so many things you could do, not just to make your voice heard by Valve in a way that they can use, but also to make your experience and the experience of everybody around you better. If you have some kind of beef with the game's balancing, go fucking fix it. And I'm sure the first thing I'm gonna hear to that is, well, random people can't just go and fix the weapons in TF2, which, like, yeah, I've been saying that, but there has literally never been a better time to get an understanding of how this game works and to submit fixes that you want. I did it. I made a small change to the BFB to make it so that your bar doesn't go down unless you take at least 8 damage. This makes it so that single pellet shots and the damage over time effects can't take away your boost. This is especially good in my opinion because burning and bleeding basically lock your boost meter down, forcing you to constantly do damage to be able to get anything out of it, as the recurring damage lowers it over and over and over, and also is at the perfect damage threshold to make it so that close range weapons like the syringe gun can still take your boost, because if you're getting hit by that, you probably should lose it, but also make it so that random stray long range hits don't take away your meter. I personally think these are small but impactful changes that almost everybody could agree would make the game better. So I grabbed the code I made, I wrote up a little explanation, and I emailed it to Eric Smith. And of course, I don't think this is really gonna work. Eric Smith probably gets about 1 million emails a day, and even if he didn't, he probably isn't going to include balance changes anymore, and he's probably especially not going to do it because some guy came up with something in an email. It might even be a violation of company policy to take ideas like this without me signing some kind of a waiver or something. I don't know. All I know is that this has the tiniest chance in hell of working, and that's about 1 million times more chances than bitching on Reddit ever will. And also, I think to a degree, this robs Eric Smith and Valve of any excuses they could make. Of course, I'm not trying to like trap a Valve developer with an email, that's what that big pit is for, but I do think that at least once you've gone through all of the proper channels and you've put everything in its right place, it's a lot harder for them to miss. And that doesn't just go for potential code changes. That goes for feedback as well, because we know for a fact at least somebody is overseeing the TF2 GitHub. Now, what you shouldn't do knowing that is go and spam the GitHub with a bunch of your stupid bullshit. What you should do instead is go make an account and see what issues have been brought up and voice your support for the things that you think are important. If you think something is missing, figure out exactly what you want and try to present it in a professional and respectful manner. But even if you don't want to mess around with a GitHub, if you're finally fed up with sitting there and queuing for casual and not having fun with it, go find a community server. Hell, go find a community that you like and just be a part of it. Fuck this stupid dice roller thing, go make some friends. Go join servers that have all of these functions we want back. You might have to wait for a full server to open up. You might have to be the 14th guy instead of the 24th. If you're really daring, you might have to smash your head against a wall trying to figure out how to make it so that the gas passer starts full instead of empty. You might even have to take a sip of the witch doctor's disgusting eyeball soup. But even if that is too much, at the very least, be angry about things that actually make sense. Like, it's crazy, but also hilarious how easy it is to enrage this community over nonsense. The most clear-cut example is probably how they treat Jill. I'ma just keep it real with y'all. 99% of you don't even know who the fuck this person is, and I think about 100% of us don't know what they do. But they get the sole blame for fucking everything, and I mean everything. I've seen people blame them for Meet Your Match, I've seen people blame them for ruining TF2, and I've seen people blame them for the comics, even though I'm fairly certain the only one of these that they've worked on that we know of for sure is Meet Your Match, and even then there was, at least by Valve's own admission, a 17-person team working on Team Fortress 2 with 5 programmers.
You said in the recent AMA that the total team size is 16. However, you specified things like sound engineers and artists and writers.
Right.
How many are like actual game programmers themselves?
Direct code writers?
Yeah.
5 or 6.
5 or 6?
Yeah.
All right, cool.
And that's assuming nobody had left the team from 2016 to 2017. So even though Jill was one of 5 people who could have worked on matchmaking, one of 17 people who were working on Team Fortress 2, and is also, you know, at a company where every other employee could decide to do whatever they want, where management lets people do whatever they want without too much oversight, but apparently it's all Jill's fault, exclusively because they're the one who had their name on a Steam group. This was one of the things that initially set me out on this quest to see just how impactful competitive players were towards this game. If the bottom feeders within this community are willing to place all of the blame for a bad thing on one person at a company of 300 people without knowing what they actually did, their job description, or who they are to any degree, then what stops them from doing the same for any other group of people or any other person for anything they don't like they may have done for competitive players? You'll have to excuse me for not being able to take the community seriously when they make things up about this person that they know nothing about, like that they're Shonik. even though the two have been in a voice call together, just because their name and handle sound a little similar. I don't know, I just think it's maybe a little bit silly to be angry at somebody when you have no idea what their role in something was or who they are. But you know what's better than getting angry? $500 million. Or not getting angry, because here's the fun thing, you can be critical of something while also keeping a level head. Because if you are going to give feedback, and again, that's your right, and it's a good thing, blah blah blah, it's better to give actionable, clear feedback than it is to have a bunch of people arguing over nonsense. Ever since Save Team Fortress 2, there have been 2 open letters sent to Valve about 2 separate issues. Mappers signed one so that they could have an update in between Halloween and Christmas, so that they wouldn't only have to make maps around these 2 themes. And guess what? We got the summer update. And much more recently, at least to when this was uploaded, there was a smaller community effort to host a petition to get free-to-plays unmuted. And if I get to upload this when I want to, anywhere near when I'm hoping to, you know that this worked. And do you want to know why it worked? It's because instead of having to comb through 1,200 Reddit posts about whatever issue with a bunch of people bickering in them, this petition had a clearly defined, realistic, actionable, and quantifiably supported goal. It's realistic because unmuting free-to-plays was probably not that much work. It was actionable because it had a defined issue that Eric Smith or whoever could fix. It wasn't something vague like, make the weapons better, or stop letting in bad cosmetics, because nobody knows what the fuck that means, and it wasn't unrealistic. There are certain things that people would like to come back or to be added to the game that are unrealistic. For example, balance patches, like I've said, are unrealistic. Like, as much as I would love to hypothetically make my own balance patch, I'm very aware that doing so probably isn't going to result in an actual balance patch being pushed into the live game. That and some other things are just not going to happen. And finally, it was able to quantify the support that this idea had by having people sign it. But of course, this only works for ideas that the community can agree on, and I think we're just about running out of those. But even outside of performing like movements or whatever, just taking every day and making it so that you're a better TF2 player today than you were the day before. And I don't mean in skill, I mean in everything, would make this game astronomically better. Be a kinder person. Don't get caught up in the mire of this stupid infighting. Get on the fucking mic, talk to people, call somebody out, say, hey, there's a fucking heavy over here on this stupid ass part of Upward. Don't leave the damn match just because you start losing for 4 seconds. Are you about to get rolled and you're worried you're not going to have fun? Try to rally the troops. Figure out what people need. You could do almost anything, and anything you pick is probably going to be more useful to Team Fortress than sitting around and blaming all of its problems on a niche part of the community that has much less agency over the game than people think they do. Because making a subsect of the community a villain not only gets you nowhere, it actually gets you somewhere in reverse. It brews unneeded animosity and forces everybody to stop talking about real issues so that we can all talk about whether or not comp players are the real issue. But also, it's just kind of pathetic that for the game where everybody is supposed to be welcome, and that is what they made, that the community has decided that the original developers had no idea what they were talking about with the game that they made, and that instead some people simply aren't welcome because they play with a slightly weird rule set. Maybe I'm biased because of my exposure to what most people would describe as sweats, but I think overall they're great people. Like, yeah, again, there's a couple of assholes in comp TF2 or who are tryhards or whatever, but there's assholes everywhere. But in my experience talking to a lot of tryhards across multiple different games, they're great. They're just interested in and excited to play the game. They want to get back out there. They want to hone their skills. They want to win their ranked matches or their officials or whatever, and they want to hit sick clips and share them with the people around them. They don't care about sitting around and being miserable, especially if you're playing a game that is no longer getting developer support. Those people don't give a shit about updates. And they also don't really care what casuals think. They're too busy just playing the game to worry about that. The fact that they don't have any real representation outside of like Solar Light to connect with quote-unquote the outside world is proof enough for me. Competitive players don't need representatives because they don't really care what the newest issue quote-unquote with Team Fortress 2 is. They just want to go back to playing in their league. But then if you go ahead and look at casuals, the story is completely different. Competitive players are largely content to just ignore casuals. There's occasionally a little public spat, but that's about it. Casual players, on the other hand, are on the 9th year of their unwinnable campaign of fraudulence designed to make a game mode that you don't have to play look bad. And I say that this is unwinnable because it is. There's no prize to claim at the end of this. And that's by design, because if it could be won, then they wouldn't be able to sit around and farm it for pity forever. If I were being generous, and I don't know why I would be, I would say this entire thing is a fantastic example of how easy it is to lie to people over the internet. But if I wasn't being generous, which I'm not, I would say that this charade is an expired and pathetic attempt to delegitimize a certain style of play and the people who like to play that way, because those people don't follow an ever-changing and imaginary code of conduct dreamt up by a bunch of nobodies. The worst part about it is that this is Team Fortress 2, the game that was built to be accepting of as many people as possible. The game that proves that you can have deep competitive gameplay that is still experimental and weird and jank and fun, where a game can be very cool at the highest levels of play and support this level of competition without being an over-engineered machine that works exactly how the developers want it. To which ends, I've seen many people in this community say things that are really dumb and unfounded, or which are just complete admitted lies, also that they can win an inescapable pot of misery at the end of the stupidity rainbow, just for the slim chance that maybe they'll convince some other person that it really was competitive players that are to blame for all of this, and then they can both go on to do absolutely nothing about it like they did yesterday together. And the fact that a non-insignificant portion of this player base thinks lying to yourself for 9 years is the most valuable solution to a problem is the most TF2 player thing I've ever fucking heard. It really, honestly, is a shame. You know, I like Team Fortress 2. I really do like this game. I think Team Fortress 2 is a showcase for a lot of things we've forgotten in modern games, especially shooters. But more than anything, Team Fortress 2 is the game that, to me, above all other examples, proves that you can have a deep, competitive game, a well-designed, deep and competitive game that is also experimental and a little bit silly. Some people might say, oh, what about Melee? And you're right, Melee is also very much like that, but Melee is largely cool by mistake. Team Fortress 2 is largely cool on purpose. And of course, it's not perfect at that, far from it, really. But in a world where, 15 weapons are banned out of 150 something in 6s, the highest upper echelons of competitive, I think it does a very good job. And of course there are other examples, but for me TF2 is the one. That's what makes it so disappointing that this game is so misunderstood, and I do think that. And I think one of the biggest examples of that is the way that this community treats its competitive players. It's truly insane how confidently this community says that they understand the integral design of this game, while saying and acting in a way that contradicts what the developers have said about this game and what they've done to it. Like, this game is so deep, so competitively solid, with the way the movement works with the rate of fire, with how the movement mechanics work, with the class design, with everything. But this community is so full of its own shit that these incredible parts of this game, these beautiful parts of this game, which in many ways have contributed greatly to its long-term success, often go completely unappreciated. And that fucking sucks.
It was just not at all, actually. The original beta was just solving a different problem. The original beta was focused on getting us feedback from a group of players that we were just having trouble getting feedback from, which was the hardcore competitive community.